who?
All right, we're going to call to order the December 16th meeting of the West Sacramento City Council and Redevelopment Agency. We're going to begin this evening as we do each week with the Pledge of Allegiance. I'd like to invite our guests to join the council and staff in the pledge, which tonight will be led by Councilmember Bill Christoff.
Salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, the council did meet in closed session this evening to confer with our labor negotiator regarding an approval of an agreement concluding labor negotiations with represented employees, in this case the West Sacramento Police Officers Association. And by a vote of 5 in favor and 0 against, the council approved a modified patrol schedule side letter agreement with the association. All right, that brings us then to our general administration function agenda, item 1A, which is presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda but within the jurisdiction of the City Council. This, although we are prohibited by state law from taking up any items that are brought forward to us under item 1A, so there won't be any discussion or action on anything that's raised in this part of our agenda. It does provide an important opportunity for a public forum. We'd ask that anyone wishing to address the council on this or any agenda item this evening to please fill out one of the yellow cards that's available at the front door and turn it into the city clerk. In front of the city clerk is a timer that we use to make sure that everyone has a chance to be heard. So to that end, we limit all testimony to no more than 3 minutes. We also recognize that for some folks, speaking in public and on television can involve some amount of anxiety and butterflies. So we just ask that there not be any boos or applause or catcalls or other demonstrations, and that we try to maintain a civil discourse in the chambers. When we get to our regular agenda items, past item 1A, the yellow cards are accepted by the city clerk up to the time of the conclusion of the staff report. Once the staff report is complete and the council questions and the public testimony have begun, we don't take any additional cards. So if you are intending to speak on one of the items that's later in the agenda, then please try to get your card in as soon as possible, because once the staff report is concluded, we won't accept any more on that particular item. So with that, we have several requests to speak under item 1A, and the first is by Bill Lowell.
Ho, 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 Mr. Mayor. Yes, William Lowell for the record. I don't know what I was thinking when I came back by way of 42A, I guess it was. It took me a little longer, but I got an interesting experience there on Main Street in front of where the Kmart used to be in Woodland. They had the same kind of bus shelter as we have over in front of 500 Jefferson Boulevard. That's a smaller blue heavy screen one, I guess you'd call it. But what I liked about the one in Woodland, it had the larger overlapping roof for better protection from the rain. But still, as I told our assistant executive director who gave me a ride out there, I told her, because of the way the wind and rain hit the back wall and could come through all those little holes, I wish they would move the bench about 8 inches further ahead, and that's about what I think they should do over there at 500 Jefferson Boulevard, but especially since it's got that opening up at the top for better rain protection. But other than that, I would just comment that I didn't have any trouble hearing anybody speak from the podium downstairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lowell. Kathy Way.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak. And we have some packages to pass to you at this moment. I was very touched by your ceremony today, and I'd like to thank all of you for a great service to us. And I have been a resident in West Sacramento for 5 years. Again, my name is Kathy Wei, and this is Michelle Chen. We're here representing New Tang Dynasty Television, and that's a TV station that is global, actually, based in New York, and the closest bureau is in San Francisco. Newtown Dynasty Television is specialized in Chinese news, you know, abroad from Asia or here. And NTD TV brings about a very beautiful performance to all over the world. And this is what this performance is. It's called Shenyun Performing Arts, and this is the first time that this performance will be in Sacramento area. It has been coming back to the Bay Area for the last 3 years. And we're here to invite all of you to the show and also to our VIP reception. A little bit more about what Shenyun is. Shenyun is a company that's based in New York. The mission is to revive 5,000 years of history of Chinese values and history, independent from the current communist propaganda. So you will sort of see that it's not from mainland China. And in the package that I've given you has a couple of things I want to show you. First is a flyer that general flyer that has the ticket information and the show times. So if you wish, you can go to San Francisco, San Jose, or in Sacramento. Also, we left some of that at the desk that anybody is interested is welcome to take it. And also, this trifold bigger flyer has the VIP reception inside it that you can RSVP to. You're all invited to that VIP reception, as well as a newspaper that has more in-depth information on the show and people's review about it. I think my time is running out. Again, this is a show that's very wholesome, very beautiful. They have original orchestra playing with the scores and original dances, and a live orchestra on the front and 3D animated backdrops. So don't miss it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, Michael Palmer.
Good evening. Thank you for listening to me for a minute. I need to ask for some help. 4 years ago, I purchased a shop over at Jefferson and Merkley. It was bankrupt pretty much and filthy dirty. Put a lot of money into it and fixed it up. Temporarily, I put a plastic bag over the sign because I couldn't put a new sign up with the 22-foot sign. I want to put a lower sign, 12-foot. I want to meet the city requirements, and I'd like to have done it 3 years ago, but I can't get a permit to do it. We have some problems with temporary setbacks and stuff that's Caltrans may eventually widen the street there. I've offered to sign a waiver that if anything happened, if Caltrans came in and wanted to widen it, I would pay for and move the sign, but I can't get an okay on that either. So pretty soon that plastic bag's going to come off in a good windstorm this winter, I think, and I'm going to have the wrong sign in front of my business. And things are tough enough without putting the wrong sign out there. I'd like to get some help and see if I can't get a permit to put the proper sign up. And I'd like to stay in business in West Sac, so I'd love to have some help if I could, please. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Palmer. And Dan Ramos.
Good evening, Mayor Cabal, member of City Council. I'll be brief because I know you got a busy agenda tonight, but I'm here actually, I'm not representing the Bridge District or the Chamber. It's actually myself and a little personal request, and I think you're going to hear from the Chamber on this. Their leaders are ready to see something more formal from the Chamber, but this is regarding their kind of the buy local and shop local campaign that the city and the Chamber are both conducting here. And what I wanted just a simple question. I know we're going to be shutting down here in a couple weeks and stuff, so I wanted to get this on the table right now, but in terms of later on this agenda, we are going to hear items regarding the Bridge District in terms of financing district and approvals and agreements. And we're ready to embark on a very large project in this community with lots of money to be spent in building public infrastructure in this community. And I just wanted to make a plea that we have an opportunity for some of our locally based consultants that are here, both in the engineering, construction management, surveying, construction staking, geotechnical firms, that are local firms that are here have an opportunity to be part of this work, or be able to be, at least get a shot at their qualification stuff and get a shot at it, and not be shut out in any process. That we got a lot of good companies located here, have been great community members that employ people who live in this community, and it just is, would be really ashamed if they just didn't have an opportunity to get an opportunity to look at this work and get a shot at this work. So just want to throw it out there. Hopefully, staff the appropriate committee and stuff like that, we can be done. I'd hate to see them not have opportunities. There's some tough times, and there's some great people out there with some great talents right here in our community, and be ashamed not to be able to have an opportunity for them. So that's all. Just wanted to make that request for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramos. All right, thank you. That concludes the presentations of item 1A. I just ask the city manager if you can, in our council update, give us a background on the sign issue. I know the council's not interested in becoming the sign review commission, and we've had a lot of those, but if we could get some basic background, and the council can determine, individual members of the council can determine whether they want to bring something else forward at a later date. Okay. All right, that brings us to item 1B, for council communications and reports. Are there any this evening? Mr. Johannesson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, the Housing and Poverty Action Coalition met this morning, and we have an agenda item on the 10-year plan. I just wanted to report that that plan was adopted by Davis and Woodland, and this week by the Board of Supervisors unanimously. The plan now would be to present it to the city here, hopefully for adoption. In February, it would be signed with a media event, and the work would start in February. And that's it.
Mr. Villegas.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District met December 9th, and the one item to note, just keeping the council posted on this as it moves forward, we were asked to, essentially the board directed staff to proceed with actions necessary to comply with the legal requirements should we decide to increase the fees effective July of 2010. As you know, the Regional Sanitation District now we are part of that, and so the collection system, with the economy and the condition that it's in, the revenues are not in as everybody would like to hope that we would be in this situation, but we're unfortunately having to consider rate hikes. We had several alternatives, and so the recommendation from the board to staff is to consider moving forward with a more modest fee than what was proposed by staff after some discussion. So it looks like it's headed towards potentially a 50% increase in the cost beginning in the 2010-11 fiscal year. So I just wanted to keep the council posted on that. 50 cent, I'm sorry. Yeah, 50 cent increase. Staff had recommended between 25 and 75. They actually wanted the alternative one, which is 75. The conversation centered around, the idea that if you go down the path of a 75 cent, which is what staff wanted, rarely has there been any time when a public entity proposed a rate of a certain amount and then actually decreased it because things somehow magically got better. That just doesn't happen. So we sort of forced the onus back on the district itself to force the conversation into why would you need the increase and justify it and be more conservative in their estimates. So 50% was what was ultimately recommended to consider as we move forward. So it's not a done deal, but it's setting it up to make sure that we're in the position to affect that 50 cent increase if need be. And then the other thing that I wanted to just make sure that everybody here knew was that as part of the district, we also have a sewer lifeline rate assistance program. It's a little known program, and I don't know if folks in West Sacramento are familiar with it, in part because we're relatively new to the district, but it's a program that allows some rate assistance for your monthly sanitation district fee and or the cost of doing the program, and there is a program available. I asked to see the numbers because there's currently 10,000 people on the program. There were no numbers available to see exactly how many folks from West Sacramento are in the program. So there's a dedicated hotline the number is 875-5500 if you're interested in seeing whether or not you qualify, because there is some rate assistance for those that would qualify. The city school
Right on the district. Mr. Christoph had a question.
I just have a question. You said a fee, or is that a residential rate increase?
I'm sorry, that's a residential rate increase.
Oh.
50-cent rate increase for, I think I said fee, you're right.
Fee, yeah, well, a fee I thought might have been a fee for, you know, developer fee or something like that. How much money do they need to raise?
You know, well, that's an interesting question. Part of the discussion was centered around exactly that. There are several different scenarios that shift the number around. So it wasn't clear exactly how much needed to be raised. So, and again, that's why this is kind of an early discussion about what the fee should be to make sure that we're balancing our books at the end of the year. So a lot of the conversation is centered around, well, what is the deficit? How do we make it up? What's the number? And so I think as we get more current projection or current estimates in January, we'll have a better sense of what that is. But staff's currently projecting that at least a minimum of 25-cent, but up to 75-cent increase in cost monthly would be necessary.
Because 50-cent increase on a percentage, that's a lot. I mean, that raises a whole ton of money. So, I mean, I certainly would like it if you, as our representative, would, you know, really question and see what we need to have that kind of an increase for, because it does raise so much money, especially over a lifetime. So, but if you could take a look at that, I certainly would be one that would be very appreciative, because that's a pretty heavy hit. I mean, that's a.
Yep. No, that's a lot. And I'll make sure the council's up to speed on that as it moves closer. We're still pretty far out. The City School 2x2 met on December 7th, and the one issue that was discussed was, one of the items was the joint use agreement. I think folks are familiar, or remember the fact that we have a joint use agreement with the school district to share the property where the high school and the rec center are located, and there was some discussion about additional public access to the stadium, because there currently is not, and so the district's moving towards finding a way to make that more publicly accessible. On, let's see, December 7th, I guess it was the same day, I've lost track of it already, we participated on behalf of the city for the mayor to the SACOG Government Relations and Public Affairs Committee. And the one item to note for the council was we received an update on the draft executive order on floodplain management. I don't know if staff has been tracking that closely, but I think they're looking for input on the actual guidelines themselves.
Oh, I'm going to talk about that in a second.
Okay. Did you want to do that now, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of my items to report.
Okay. Did you want to share with that?
Sure. So I was not at that meeting because I was representing the city at a U.S. Conference of Mayors Summit on water in Washington, D.C. And there, before I get to that item, there were two purposes for being there, and it was why I wasn't present at the last council meeting. The first was we were having a session with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on flood protection generally and levee investments. It was a very general session, but it was an opportunity to spend some time with Steve Stockton, who I think many of you have met because he was out here. He's the Director of Civil Works for the Corps, but also the military leadership, the general and the major general in charge of the Corps of Engineers, who, to my surprise, knew almost everything about us. And several of the big city mayors who said they can't get their calls returned were astounded at how much the Corps' top leadership were aware of, and were freely citing West Sacramento examples on the port, on the land exchange, which I was amazed that the major general knew anything about, and definitely on the whole issue around levee investments and on floodplain management. So it was, although that specific session wasn't oriented towards driving to a specific policy outcome, it was very gratifying to see that the Corps perceives their relationship with us as something that they're proud of and see as a model, or at least an excuse when they tell other cities that it is possible to do something good. So that was positive. The next day, and the primary reason I was there was for meeting with the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, so the president's lead environmental advisor. It's the CEQ that is promulgating this draft executive order that we've talked about here before, that takes a 1978 executive order by President Carter that limited federal investment in 100-year floodplains and tightens it up, so it would truly limit it. It would make it very difficult for any federal investments in highways or schools or hospitals or clinics or levees or other sorts of things to be undertaken in floodplains, but also expand the definition of floodplains to include 500-year floodplains, not 100-year floodplains, which is a very large footprint, not just here, but across the country, because across the history of human civilization, people have settled near water. So it's not surprising that many, many, many cities around the country share this concern. And so 2 months ago, I was asked to lead the conference's work on trying to convince the White House to move on this issue, because the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality is a Californian, and I served with her on the water board here. So we met with her for about an hour. She's clearly frustrated with this issue, because she didn't expect that this was going to be such a firestorm, because it's one of those issues that just people first hear about, and they're like, well, of course, we shouldn't be spending money in floodplains, until you tell them that there's 25 million Americans living in these floodplains, and you can't just abandon them and say we're no longer going to have hospitals or schools or roads, and we're not going to improve your levees to improve your safety. So we made the direct case on why, as a floodplain risk management matter, it's bad federal policy to do that the actual total aggregate level of risk to life and property is higher if we make no investments, either directly or if we cut off local governments' abilities and state governments' abilities to finance levee improvements. So if we leave the existing population at risk by not making any improvements in levees, that the total amount of risk to life and property is higher than if a few more people move in, but we're able to substantially strengthen our system of levees and flood protection. So I made that argument directly, but also have been launching a different tack around the relationship between this and climate change, which we know is a big priority for the President and for the White House, and in particular for the Council on Environmental Quality. If you take and SACOG, I have to say, has been extremely helpful on this issue. Which is important, because SACOG has this national reputation on climate change and the blueprint and responsible land use, and so their involvement seems less sort of self-interested than ours does. So they've been very helpful. They produced a series of maps that showed that the blueprint, the sort of nationally recognized model for how to do land use and to achieve significant reductions in the carbon footprint of new development, overlays almost exactly with a 500-year floodplain, so that if you were to adopt the executive order as it's drafted and push all investment and population growth outside of that 500-year floodplain, the impact on the amount of vehicle miles traveled by people, have to drive farther to get to work and to get into childcare, the sprawling land patterns that get created, the consumption of agricultural land and habitat, the impacts on greenhouse emissions are severe. And there's no way for the state to achieve its AB 32 goals around greenhouse gas emissions, or for the President's goals that relate to the cap and trade framework to be achieved, if that were to happen on a large-scale basis. That argument's actually quite compelling to the White House, and so there's some significant backtracking. What the chair of the Environmental Quality Council indicated at that meeting was that they were going to pull back the executive order draft and convene a federal interagency task force on flood management chaired by the Corps and FEMA to look at this whole issue, including the executive order, but this broader set of issues, which we said was a good idea, but that the task force shouldn't only be composed of floodplain agencies. That if we're really talking about these climate change issues and economic development issues, and the environmental justice issues associated with saying the federal government's no longer invest in central cities, that those other stakeholders need to be at the table as well, so that we don't just get a policy that's based on floodplain management as floodplain alone, as though we don't exist as other things. So she agreed. She hinted that she was going to ask somebody outside of federal government, which I suspect might end up being one of us, to serve on that task force as well, but at this stage we don't know. But what that means from a direct basis is we're at least a year away, because the task force hasn't been named, and then we'll have to meet for some time to work through the executive order. So the instant threat is at least avoided. And I should say, in response to Mr. Villegas' comment, our staff has been extremely involved in this. Mr. Panos and his team, and Julie Minerva and our team out in Washington, D.C. have been very closely involved in analyzing the impacts, crafting some alternatives, helping the White House understand what the implications are, and it's been very effective. So it's surprising how few people are working on this in the country. But our little group in our tiny little city has been a pretty significant driver on this. So far so good, but the threat's certainly still out there over the long run.
So if I can,
Yeah.
sorry. No, that's good. And I think that explains the face expressions that I got from staff when I asked whether or not there had been comments from West Sacramento. So I think you've been shepherding the process very well. So that was the one item to note on the Government Affairs Committee. Under the Transportation Committee, which occurred on December 3rd, the one item, and I think you're probably also pretty familiar with, the 2010 federal and state programming. And I know you'd mentioned it before in terms of West Sacramento coming out pretty well in terms of the competitive nature of these grants, the funding, but overall, I think West Sacramento did very well. And just for the council's edification, the Tower Bridge Gateway Modification Project, we applied for that. Staff did an amazing job with that application, requesting $4.2 million and receiving at least in terms of the staff's recommendation, receiving the entire $4.2 million for that project. So that's a huge coup for West Sacramento. Not everybody there was excited about the recommendations. Not everybody fared as well as West Sacramento. In fact, there was a lot of discussion about, well, I shouldn't say discussion. There was interest in potentially tweaking the process, and so I think staff did a marvelous job of presenting our proposal, getting it recommended for funding, and so I was there to ensure that the process and the integrity of the process was not tweaked with after the fact. So we did very well with that one. And we also did well, although we did not get full funding, we received at least, well, half of the funding, just about, and that's about $500,000 for the Clarksburg branch line trail, the north segment of the bridge only. So that one's another one that I don't know if we need the entire other half of it to make it happen, but it sounds like we're well on our way for that one. So congratulations, and thanks to staff. I mean, it was pretty clear. The proposals were very competitive. There's not a lot of money, but West Sacramento came out pretty well. There was interest in an after-action discussion for those large cities and counties across the river that did not do nearly as well, and I'm sure the staff is having a good time with that, but that's it.
Yep. And tomorrow, I will be appointed chair of that committee, so that we will retain our comparative advantage in the region on the transportation side. That was a good one. Earlier in the week, the Yolo County Transportation District Board met, and we took up the issue that Mr. Villegas was just describing, so I won't repeat it. Also heard our report on sales tax receipts. Sales taxes generated in the county are the primary means of supporting the operations of transit, Yolo Bus and paratransit in particular. As the council is aware, it's the sales tax generated in the county, throughout the county, so West Sac and the other cities primarily, but it's distributed based on population. So even though we in Woodland are, generating well over, we're 2/3 or more of the sales tax in the county, the amount that comes back to us for transit services is much, much, much smaller than that. But the total is significant. I think it's down 17%. What that means is that we and Davis have a deficit in our transit funding. For the county, for Winters, and for Woodland, it means they have to cut funding for road projects. Because if you'll recall, they're not spending their full transit allocation on transit, so they're able to divert some to roads. But that means now they have to cut roads, because the law requires that if you're going to make cuts, you have to cut first the road money. We have to cut the transit allocations, and so we're going to be looking over at the next board meeting at strategies for achieving those reductions in both through some efficiencies and some service reductions on Yolo Bus in particular, a little bit on paratransit, but to try to make sure that we come in on budget. We did make some sort of instant modifications on Monday night to transit services, and so effective February 1st, there'll be small changes to Route 41, Route 40, and Route 35 that mostly involve cutting the very last route or the very first route. We have a few routes in the city where for the entire length of the bus line, the total numbers of boardings for the entire line is 3, 2, or less than 1. And it's just it's not an efficient use of the transit resources to maintain those. And so we'd like to, because having the possibility of transit makes it possible for people to adjust their longer term habits and stuff to it. But we can't with a $250,000 deficit. We've got to make some reductions, and so those will be the first round, and then we'll look at some more some tougher service reductions, as I say, in January and February to make sure that we come in on budget. Okay, so that concludes council communications. We have no appointments this evening, so we're going to proceed to, and we've already, at a ceremony held earlier this evening, provided our 2009 Employee Service Awards. So we're now going to move to item 3, which is consideration of a selection of Mayor Pro Tem. We've all been through this several times, so I don't think we need a staff report. Is there a, so we'll open nominations. Mayor Pro Tem Beers?
Yeah, I'd like to nominate Oscar Villegas.
All right.
Mr. Mayor?
Mr. Christoph?
I'd like to nominate Mark Johannesson. He has never served in that position. I think all of us have, and I think now's the time that he move into the position of Mayor Pro Tem.
Okay. All right, and these nominations don't require a second, and we don't typically have speeches unless either of the two nominees would like to make them. Okay. All right, then, Madam, are there any further nominations? If not, then nominations will be closed, and ask the clerk to call the roll.
What are we doing?
How do we do?
Pardon?
Wait a minute. Call the roll for what?
We have two nominees.
Okay.
Name the nominee.
The two nominees are Mr. Villegas and Mr. Johannesson.
Okay.
Just
So
name
as,
the-
yes, as the clerk calls your name, please vote for one of the two nominees.
Oh, all right. Okay.
A little out of,
No, I think that I remember a
don't
time when we
think
didn't
so.
used to do it that way. When we'd get one nominee and vote, but I think the last couple times we've done it this way.
Okay.
All right, Madam Clerk, please.
Mayor Pro Tem Beers,
Mr. Villegas,
Councilmember Christoph,
Mr. Johannesson.
Mayor Cabaldon,
Mr. Villegas?
Councilmember Villegas.
I guess I say myself, is that what I say? Yeah, Villegas, does that work for you,
I
Janet?
defer
You may
that.
say whatever you choose.
What it is.
All right.
Is that what you're going with?
right.
I'm sorry.
And Johannesson.
Okay, so Oscar.
All right, so
So Mr. Councilmember Villegas has the majority vote.
okay, so Mr. Villegas is elected as the new Mayor Pro Tem. Congratulations. And I'd like to particularly acknowledge Mayor Pro Tem Beers for his service this year. It's always a difficult job because the job of the Mayor Pro Tem is varied, but one of them is subbing in for the mayor at all sorts of community events and activities. And in part because of the state water package and this thing at the White House, I've been sort of instantly grabbed to go somewhere else, and the Mayor Pro Tem has been called upon to do stuff, with 5 minutes notice, and has done and we've had a lot of projects and activities, and so there's been your leadership in the community has been very, very much appreciated, and thank you very much for the work that you've done over the last year. Appreciate it. All right, that brings us to our consent agenda, which is items 4 through 16. Are there any items on consent that any member of the council wishes to remove, or any item for separate question or comment?
Question on 9.
9?
Question on 8?
All right, item 8 is consideration of second reading and adoption of ordinance 09-12, repealing and reenacting the Plan Development Number 41 and ordinance 0913, rezoning 1501 and 1801 South River Road from waterfront to waterfront Plan Development Number 41. Mr. Christoph.
Hello. I just have a question. And the question is on page 3 of 6 in our staff report,
Okay.
very first paragraph. In the middle of that paragraph, it says the first phase, let's see, the city has appropriated approximately $4 million for Prop 1C, construction design, engineering, environment today. This will be partially reimbursed by I guess, how much money is lacking? What's the reimbursable amount?
$2.9 million is what would be reimbursable by the state.
Okay, 2.9, and so we have to make up the difference, or who makes up the difference for the 4 million?
That's going to be tax increment. Katie, you want to give up? She's the finance person.
Okay. Oh, the tax increment then.
Yes, that was appropriated in our CIP for
The
07.
tax increment that piece of property generates, right?
This is the engineering and design and surveying and legal work that staff has to do in order to get ready for construction on the grant. So a lot of that is being advance funded, but then the state will reimburse quite a chunk of it, as well as the CFD.
I guess the question I have is, where was the tax increment is going to be used to upfront the monies?
Correct.
Where was that money generated?
Throughout the entire redevelopment area.
Okay, thank you. I had a reason for asking that, because we talk about something later. And stay right there. No, that's fine. Thank you very much. That'll be enough.
Come back.
That'll do it.
All right, thank you. Item 9 is consideration of a Public Works contract award to GHH Engineering Incorporated for environmental remediation services for 1725 West Capitol Avenue. Mr. Johannesson.
Paul, on this, the award of this contract, what outreach did you do to try to look at local contractors that might be able to do this type of work? I see that there was Sierra Chemical is involved with this, but can you just describe, are there any companies in West Sac that could do the remediation work?
I can't say for certain. This appears to be a fairly specialized process in terms of doing this type of remediation work. We followed the normal public works process. It went out to 16 bid houses, and then it was advertised on our own website, and then we responded the normal fashion that the public works bid was released. So that's my response.
Well, I mean, I would like to see whenever, because we've continued to talk about, the work that's coming out of the city, the Shop Local, Think Local campaign. I would like some explanation of the outreach efforts to West Sacramento businesses when we have these contracts let, just so we can see progress in that direction.
Sure.
All right, then we have the consent agenda before us, items 4 through 16. Is there a motion?
Second.
All right, it's been moved by Mayor Pro Tem Villegas and seconded by Mr. Beers. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. That brings us to our time-set agenda, item 17, which is a community development block grant public hearing to consider the Yolo County 10-year homeless plan and a housing condition survey conducted with CDBG funding.
Good evening. Staff respectfully requests that the City Council conduct a public hearing this evening to receive public comment on 2 activities that have been funded with Community Development Block Grant funds received from the State of California Department of Housing and Community Development. These are also known as CDBG funds. The first activity was the development of a housing conditions survey. The survey examined 5,272 single-family units in our older neighborhoods. That is actually nearly half of all single-family homes in West Sacramento. Over 35% of these homes were found to have moderate to major rehabilitation needs. Over 1,200 multifamily units were surveyed, and nearly half were identified as needing major rehabilitation. Results from this survey have been entered into the city's GIS system, and by the way, that was also a former CDBG grant that helped to develop that system. And these results will be used to tailor city rehabilitation programs to preserve and maintain the city's housing stock for future. Paul Dirksen, the manager of the Housing and Community Investment Division, is available if you have any questions regarding the housing condition survey. Okay, the second activity that we're discussing this evening is the known as the Homeless 10-Year Plan. In 2007, the City of West Sacramento, along with Davis, Woodland, Winters, and Yolo County, embarked on an effort to identify compassionate, cost-effective, and long-term strategies to assist the most vulnerable residents of our community. The result of this 2-year odyssey is the draft document before you entitled One Piece at a Time, Ending and Preventing Homelessness for Yolo County Residents. Several hundred residents participated in plan development, both within the cities and in the far reaches of the northern rural areas. We received many, many comments. They ranged from ideas for advocacy at the federal policy level to comments such as, you really need to do something about the folks living behind the dumpster at the truck stop. We were very fortunate to have a talented and dedicated consultant, Bridget Kirk DeYoung, from Home Base, to help us make sense of it all and to translate our thoughts into a cohesive, functional format that can be used as a blueprint for redesigning how homeless funding and services are provided throughout the county. At every junction, participants endeavored to maximize existing resources to gain the best possible results with the least possible cost. The end result is that the participants felt that resources can be best used and homelessness can be best addressed by focusing on 3 activities. First is the prevention and early intervention systems, because it is far less expensive to keep a family in housing than it is to get someone back on their feet after an incidence of homelessness. Secondly is to create affordable housing choices affordable to extremely low income. And third is to provide the supportive services needed for families and individuals facing challenges to maintain their housing once they receive it. The plan concludes with an implementation strategy that establishes a governance structure which is tasked with execution of the policies outlined in the document. We anticipate returning to Council with a resolution to formally adopt the plan after the first of the year, and plan implementation is expected in February 2010. This evening's public hearing is just the CDBG public hearing to receive public comments on the document. Persons wishing to show their support of the plan can go to the Home Base website and endorse the plan. And Bridget, our consultant, is available for any questions you may have.
All right, other questions this time?
This time.
Okay. All right, we do have several requests for public comment on this item, so we'll open the public hearing on item 17. Begin with Leona Jolf, Executive Director of the Yolo Wayfarer Center.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. First, I just wanted to say thank you. I've been working on homeless issues for the last 8 years in Yolo County and specifically in Woodland. And we have very much appreciated Louise Collis and Councilmember Johannesson and the efforts of the City of West Sacramento to really step up and take an active role in participating with the coalition and making some real progress in this area. And we appreciate that and want to acknowledge the city for that. Additionally, I just want to say that we are very excited about the plan and the amount of work that went into it throughout all of Yolo County and in the cities, and that we hope that you will excitedly support this plan and continue to support it. What we don't want is this to just become another binder that sits on the shelf. We want to make sure that it has leadership, that it has staff time, and that we really make some progress in this area. We're looking at regional collaboration and putting all of our resources together cohesively in a way that is most efficient for all of us. And as Wayfarer, I want to extend our efforts to the city and anything that we can do in supporting your efforts here in this community. We fought the hard fight and got a shelter that serves a number of folks, and you all support that shelter, the cold weather shelter in Woodland, which, by the way, is significantly underfunded. We get about $6 per person per night right now to provide that service. But with this plan in place and with your support and leadership, we can really make a difference and change the way that homelessness looks in Yolo County. Thank you.
Thank you. Jania Critchlow, the Yolo County Homeless Coordinator.
Hi,
I'm Janice Critchlow, and I am the Yolo County Homeless Coordinator. And I wanted to thank you for your leadership, because City of West Sacramento spearheaded the grant writing that allowed us to get the funds for this planning effort, and really brought in the other cities in the county to work on this. So thank you very much. And Louise has been mentioned, but we couldn't have done it without Louise or Bridget. And, you know, sometimes I hear, well, we're never going to end homelessness. And there's probably some truth to that. But what we can end is the assumption that we have to accept homelessness, that we can manage it, and that's about it. And instead say, what else can we do differently? How can we make everything work together? And one example of this came out in the planning process, because we needed to discuss how were we going to prevent homelessness. And at the same time, there was an opportunity to apply for the HPRP funds, the Homelessness and Rapid Rehousing Stimulus funds. And so we actually ran those two planning processes together. We ended up with the prevention section. We also ended up with a grant application that of 65 applications, we were ranked 4th, and now we're going to have $1.6 million over the next 2 years in Yolo County to help people who are on the verge of losing their rental housing and or help them get back into housing almost immediately. So that's just an example. So in a way, yes, we need to adopt this, but the plan's already working. So thank you.
Thank you. Joan Beasley, the Program Manager for the Yolo County Department of Alcohol, Drug, and Mental Health.
Good evening. I would just like to say that the Yolo County Department of Alcohol, Drug, and Mental Health Services supports the 10-year plan to address homelessness, and we've received the support of our Director, Kim Suderman, at yesterday's Board of Supervisors meeting. We're especially aware of the need to provide services to those homeless who are seriously mentally ill in our community and help them to access integrated services. And we think this is definitely a step in the right direction, and lend our support to the plan. Thank you.
Thank you. And Bill Lowell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. William Lowell, West Sacramento, for the record. And as I've mentioned a few times before, I think it's very important that we address this issue, because I think it's not only less expensive, but it's a lot safer to the rest of the public if we can not only prevent homelessness, but homelessness often leads to crime to survive. And then that is much more expensive and much more dangerous to the rest of us. I mean, I think it's a lot less expensive to prevent homelessness than it is to support the wrongdoers in prison after they've committed the crime and after people have been harmed, and sometimes irreparably. So, like the old slogan goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and a lot less pain too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lowell. All right, with that, well, those are all the requests to speak. So we're going to close the public hearing on item 17 and return to the council for any additional questions or comments. Mr. Johannesson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, this is, I'd like to thank Louise for the hard work that she's done through the city to work on this program. This has been a long process, a lot of administrative time, I'm sure. But the goals in this plan are fairly modest, and it really recognizes kind of a thinking shift toward just putting up shelters and using that, basically treating the symptom rather than looking at the root problem. And what this plan looks at are things that create homelessness. We've talked about it before here, that it's this interdiction at an early stage, either trying to keep someone in their current residence or get them into some type of support services. It's shown to be hugely less expensive than building shelters. In fact, you'll see in the comments in the report that just to provide services, these type of support services for 22 families costs the same as one emergency shelter unit. So the focus is not, of course, we need additional housing and ultra low or very, very low housing. That's always going to be an issue, but it's also to find a way to effectively marshal what limited resources we have to bring the support in early on in the homelessness. So this plan basically looks at prevention, the linking housing with the supportive services, and then the implementation, which is going to require leadership in the county and the cities, and also the creation of a structure in the county to deal with this. And the hard task is really going to be how this is implemented and to make sure that you know, the cities are committed to doing this. It's important. It's going to require resources, but you know, it's again, it's money well spent versus dealing with the problem. Now, the West Sac's kind of in a particular situation. We have homeless here, and the majority of the homeless we have in West Sacramento are West Sacramento residents. But we do have a lot of crossing the borders between Sacramento and West Sacramento. So this is not really a West Sacramento issue. It's more of a regional issue, which is going to require dialogue with Sacramento on how we deal with this. Sacramento has a 10-year plan. Hopefully we'll fully support the 10-year plan in its draft form tonight. But I think what is going to be needed between Sacramento and West Sacramento is a higher level dialogue on homelessness, possibly at a council to council 2x2, which I would suggest the council consider instituting to start talking about these bigger issues, because really a lot of this is it gets to be political. It's a question of priorities, spending priorities, and vision, and that type of thing, that it really has to come above the staff level and really kind of jump it up a notch. So as Louisa mentioned, there is a form to endorse this. It's online, a simple form, just your name, and you would endorse the 10-year plan. What is going to happen, hopefully, is the plan will be signed in February, and with a list of endorsees as an attachment to that. So I would encourage all my fellow council people to sign those endorsements, and also others in the community to do the same thing. I would I fully support this. I think it's good work. Homelessness, again, it's not only in West Sacramento, not only benefiting the people who are actually homeless, but it's also an issue of people that live here, particularly in the Washington neighborhoods and some of the newer revitalization areas that we're trying to bring in people. It's a problem that we need to deal with. We can't ignore it, and I think this is a modest plan to at least seriously address homelessness issues in West Sacramento.
All right, thank you, Mr. Johansson. I want to acknowledge Mr. Johansson's work on this. Is a tough issue, a difficult one with no easy solutions, and also a storied history in our own city of trying to tackle this one. And so it's taken some courage and a lot of work to take this on. And so I want to thank you for your work so far on this, and I know we're all committed to bringing it to conclusion. Mr. Christoph.
Yeah, Louise, where'd you go? Over there.
There's no microphone over there, Louise.
Yeah. I have a couple questions.
Yes.
Where's the funding going to come from?
That is an excellent question.
Really?
And that will be, that we have tangled with that. And the first job of the advisory body that will be leading this plan under the implementation strategy will be to help hammer out funding strategies. Most of the things that are going to be done under this plan will be done with existing resources. We will simply target them in particular areas. For example, CDBG funds or home funds or existing funding. The one piece that does not have, that needs probably new funding would be actual administration of the plan. And so that is something that the nonprofits and the community will probably be looking to the cities and the county for some leadership on taking their role to secure that.
And what's the ballpark figure?
It depends on how it's staffed. They would like to see at least a half-time, possibly a full-time staff person. So,
Because as I read through this, I looked and I see in lieu of fees on taxes of commercial square footage. So that would be taxing square footage, buildings and things like that.
those are ideas that have come from what other jurisdictions are using currently. So those are put forward for discussion, not
Yes.
not
Not
no
implementation.
determinations have been made.
Okay. And it talks about establish a countywide administrative and governing body structure with legitimate representation, power, and so forth. They would not have the power to, in essence, dictate what jurisdictions contribute. They wouldn't have the power for land use decisions, right?
They would not have land use decisions. As far as what jurisdictions contribute, we are hoping to have leadership from the jurisdictions on this body. So they would have input. They would not have decision-making.
But each body would have its own autonomy.
Yes.
Okay.
As over their own funds, yes. But there would be some collective decision-making on ways to collaborate better, ways to use resources better on a regional basis. That's what we're hoping for.
Well, I guess my major concern is, here in a week, I'm getting ready to lay off 200 and some odd people here in the city. We take a furlough week off, right? And I have some concerns. I would like to see those people continue to work before I put funds into some kind of a homeless program. I mean, from my priority and pecking order, it's more important to have all of my city employees working than it is to have some of them work and some of them not, if we're going to chap general fund revenues. And so far, as I read through everything, I just wasn't sure. I mean, if it's just the acquisition of grants, if it's, getting state grants, federal grants, home funds, or whatever it is, that's a whole different ballgame. But if it's trying to get to the city's general fund, then I have some concerns.
Well,
Okay?
we haven't identified a funding
I know,
source.
I
But I
understand
tell
that.
you,
Okay.
my kind of gut reaction is that it will take a combination of both. One or the other will not work. Grant funds come and go, and they are not always a steady, reliable funding stream. So if you're going to hire a person, that you need to have something that's a little more steady to back them up with. But no city in Yolo County, and the county especially, will be able to fund this themselves out of their general fund either. So I think the best of both worlds would be to seek a solution that would utilize both.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Villegas?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, thank you. This is a very good report. I wasn't sure what to expect. I know when we embarked on this some time back, but I think you've done, and many, everybody's participation has created a good document. I think what's particularly helpful for me is the housing conditions survey, because I think it speaks to kind of where we are today. What I think it needs to address, or maybe not this document, but what needs to be attached to this is maybe what we have done relative to what the goals are that are laid out in the plan itself. Because I think if you take a snapshot of where we are today, it doesn't accurately reflect what we've done and what your shop has done relative to the housing conditions and the housing stock here in West Sacramento as it pertains to particularly the low income and the very low income in terms of our affordable housing and how aggressive we've been in promoting affordable housing here in West Sacramento. And I think we need to get, I don't say credit for it, but I think we need to have that memorialized as we move forward with the plan. I know we're starting from this point forward, but I think it needs to come, it needs to be recognized as we move forward. I actually think that part of the discussion needs to the extent possible, align its, part of what you've laid out here, I guess, is a very compelling case, at least in the survey itself, the housing condition survey, a very compelling case for how we can continue, we can support this 10-year plan just in a few areas. For example, the housing conditions of some of our units on page 6 of 13 of the report itself indicates that over 500 units either require major rehabilitation or are flat out dilapidated. And I think that's one area in which we could focus our energy. And the look on your face, I'm either reading it wrong or you've not seen that page. So please correct me if I'm misunderstanding.
You mentioned both reports, and so I'm trying to figure out which one you're referring to. There's
I'm going back and
10-year
forth.
plan, okay.
Yeah, I'm going back and forth because I see the two work in tandem. I mean, obviously, the 10-year plan needs to have some semblance of, what we want to accomplish. And in order to figure out how we're going to be able to affect some of the things that you want to accomplish in the plan, we need to know kind of what the status of our current stock is, right? I'm assuming that was in part why the two are together, right? I mean, is that?
The two are linked. They are on the same agenda this evening just because they are both CDBG planning grants. But there's definitely the available affordable housing stock definitely affects homelessness, and one of the goals of the homeless plan is to provide more affordable housing. So there's absolutely a
Okay,
link.
maybe I just jumped to that conclusion because of the way they're laid out, the way they're presented. But I do think they ought to go together. I mean, I think obviously some of the goals that you speak about or that are addressed in the plan itself, the 10-year plan.
And they're both elements of the city's housing element.
That's right.
So they both relate to that document. Mhm.
Okay, all right. So I guess I'm just making sure that I'm understanding kind of where you're going, or where, at least where you intend to go, because I think that's an area we ought to focus our efforts on as we try to affect some of the parts of this plan that otherwise will just sit on a shelf, as many plans do. I think it's something that we've already dedicated some resources to, as Bill alluded to. I mean, if there are things that were already in play, we ought to continue down that path.
Paul, you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I think you bring a good point up. As we say in the report, the information from the Housing Condition Survey has already been loaded up to the city's GIS, and it's our intent to then also map where we have put in rehabilitation assistance in those neighborhoods, and as we always have promoted, best on the block to see whether or not that has spillover effects. So we'll be looking at that in the future.
Cool. Great. Thank you.
Other comments? All right, then the staff's requesting that we accept both the plan and the housing condition surveys. This is not an endorsement or an adoption of the plan. It's simply a requirement of the grant that we essentially acknowledge that we have heard and received it, but it will be back on a substantive basis for us in the new year. Is there a motion to that effect? Mr. Johansson moves. Mr. Beer seconds. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none. That motion carries unanimously. That brings us now to item 18, which is a presentation and discussion on draft ordinance 10-2, amending the municipal code and regulating medical marijuana dispensaries. And just a reminder for those who've come in late who might be new to our process, if you're intending to speak on this item, you need to get a card in to the city clerk prior to the conclusion of the staff report. As soon as that report is finished, we won't take any additional cards. And we don't take cards if you want to hop up in the middle of the meeting and disagree with somebody else that spoke from the public just before you. So you need to turn in the card. I have, just so everyone, including the council, is aware, I have about a dozen cards at this stage. But the cards are available at the front door and can be turned into the clerk. All right, Mr. Ricola.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. Tonight's presentation will involve two parts. First of all, I will review how we got to the ordinance that's before you tonight, and then City Attorney's Office will provide a discussion of legislative intent, ever-changing case law, and the key provisions of the ordinance. So beginning in 2009, the City Planning Division started receiving increasing calls for opening medical marijuana dispensaries in the city. Since it was not identified as a use on the matrix, we determined it was a conditional use. On July 8th, the City Council, because of multiple inquiries, the Council adopted an urgency ordinance making medical marijuana dispensaries not allowed under the terms of the moratorium. On August 5th, the Planning Unit presented an interim report to the City Council detailing 5 potential reports or 5 potential options as ways of looking at medical marijuana. Based on that meeting, the Council directed staff to develop a hybrid approach involving both a conditional use permit process as well as a business license process. And the ordinance that is before you tonight reflects that direction. On August 19th, the City Council adopted a 6-month moratorium extending the medical marijuana moratorium until the 22nd of February. As part of that direction, the Council also asked that we meet with interested stakeholders. And on the 18th of November, that was done. We met with approximately 20 stakeholders, received a series of comments, as well as other comments before you tonight have been summarized in attachment 3 of the staff report that's before you. The Planning Commission conducted a workshop on this item on December 3rd and is scheduled to conduct a public hearing tomorrow night. Now, due to the limited number of council meeting opportunities available in the next month, the ordinance that before you tonight cannot be adopted by January 22nd and become effective before the February 22nd deadline. So staff will be coming back before you on the 13th of January regarding extension of that ordinance. The council has a couple of options that it can proceed with regarding the extension of the moratorium. First of all, it could extend the moratorium for up to additional 1 year, accounting for the previous extension. So it could go as far as to February 2011. That action of the council will require a 4/5 vote. Dispensaries would not be allowed to file for entitlements during that moratorium period. A second option would be just to allow the moratorium to expire. And if the council chose this option, then medical marijuana with dispensaries would be a conditional use in all zones of the city and would be regulated through the same conditions of approval, just as other conditional uses are regulated. So with those brief remarks, I would now like to turn it over to Bob Murphy.
Mr. Mayor, in a moment, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Mona Ibriani from my office, who's been working with the staff and meeting with various stakeholders. I just kind of want to set that up. We wanted to spend just a very short introduction here, and that's what Ms. Ibriani is going to do, talking about the California Attorney General's discussion of what under the Prop 215 and implementing legislation is perceived to be allowed under those state laws and what is not allowed under those state laws. And then the completely distinct issue of what is left, given those state laws, for a city such as West Sacramento to regulate or not regulate. So with that, with your permission, I'll turn it over to Ms. Ibriani.
Good evening, Mayor Cabalden, honorable members of the council. As many of you know, the Compassionate Use Act was enacted in 1996, and it's also known as Prop 215, the purpose of which was to provide access of medical marijuana to seriously ill Californians, while simultaneously ensuring that there's no diversion of marijuana for non-medicinal purposes. I want to make it clear that Prop 215 did not legalize marijuana. In fact, Prop 215 simply set forth exemptions for patients and their caregivers to be able to use medical marijuana and protect them from criminal prosecution. In 2005, the Medical Marijuana Program Act was enacted, and it's basically the implementing legislation of the Compassionate Use Act, and it provided us with a little bit more guidance on how patients and their caregivers could dispense, use, and cultivate medical marijuana. There's two really important statutes within the Medical Marijuana Program Act, which was codified in the Health and Safety Code, one of which allows the Attorney General to come up with further guidelines. And the other one is Health and Safety Code Section 11362.83, which expresses that nothing in this article shall prevent a city or other local governing body from adopting and enforcing laws that are consistent with the Medical Marijuana Program Act. So we're fast forwarding now to 2008, and this is the year that the Attorney General did in fact adopt and establish guidelines for the security and non-diversion of marijuana for medicinal purposes. And the Attorney General opined that the only legally recognized form of association is through a collective or a cooperative. And in order to be a lawful collective or cooperative, it must be nonprofit and it must only be open to its members. And it's really important that these collectives and cooperatives also, as part of their purpose, ensure that there's no non-diversion of marijuana for non-medicinal purposes. So in other words, if an association does not comply with the nonprofit status and being exclusively open to its members, then it's an unlawful association. We also had some recent court case that was out of the Court of Appeals. And in interpreting the Compassionate Use Act and the Medical Marijuana Program Act, that court held that cities, through their police powers, may in fact regulate collectives and cooperatives through land use regulations. So the ordinance before you tonight is essentially a proposed land use regulation of dispensaries, and that term is defined in this ordinance to mean nonprofit cooperatives and collectives. Thank you.
All right. One of the issues that we're going to hear about this evening is with respect to sales. Maybe you could go into that in a little more, into a little bit more detail around the state of the case law and interpretations with respect to particularly the word sale, but sale in a general way.
Yes, I can. Would you like me to do that now?
Yeah.
The Attorney General has opined that medical marijuana cannot be sold, and the term sales is essentially improper. Medical marijuana can be dispensed and it can be obtained, and the purpose behind this, again, goes behind the establishment of nonprofit collectives and cooperatives. Any money that is generated should exclusively go back to funding the collective or the cooperative in the reasonable costs of dispensing, processing, and other functions in furtherance of that collective or cooperative. The one exception, and it was just deemed by the State Board of Equalization to be, is that the state does tax medical marijuana dispensaries, but that's the only anomaly. And as I'm sure you'll hear more throughout this evening, the law is quite murky in this area, but it has been made clear that medical marijuana is not to be sold. It's supposed to be obtained or dispensed. To the extent that money is exchanged, it's for the reasonable cost of procurement.
And this is also what the Los Angeles Superior Court is at least indicated it's intending to rule with respect to the sales issue as well?
I believe so.
Okay. But the Board of Equalization is considering this a sales tax, or is it a use tax? Is it? I forget what the other, the related concept to the sales tax is. But have they defined it as a sales tax eligible product?
For purposes of the state sales tax, that's correct.
Okay, but so, but only for their purposes. If the sales tax is collected pursuant to that order, the full portion of the sales tax is collected, not just the portion that goes to the state. I just want to be clear, right?
That's correct, and the Attorney General has acknowledged, it has not opined the legality of local jurisdictions being able to tax for their local sales tax, but the Attorney General certainly has acknowledged that jurisdictions may tax sales.
Okay, and I know I was going to ask you about this, but the Sonoma Superior Court or, I think it was last week, a judge in Sonoma invalidated the county's ordinance that, although it's not identical to ours in any ways, it's intended to to create the regulatory mechanism. And although I haven't seen it, I mean, the only press reports were that he invalidated it on the basis of the requirement that there be a special use permit, which is what we require also. So do we know much about that at this stage?
I did contact Sonoma County Council this morning to get a little bit more information. And while it is true that their ordinance that was adopted in 2007 was overturned by the trial court, there's a couple of important points. Number one, that's a trial court decision, and it was based on a temporary restraining order. And the judge has not, based on my information from Sonoma County Council, made any determination about specific components of the ordinance. And the county is, in fact, going back on a motion for reconsideration, but the facts are entirely distinguishable from the facts here. And after review of that decision and speaking with Sonoma County Council, I'm confident that the proposed ordinance before you tonight is it's legally proper.
All right, and the press accounts can't be accurate anyway in this case because the appellate court ruling couldn't be clearer. I mean, the appellate court ruling over and over and over again says nothing in Prop 215, nothing in the Vasconcelos legislation diminishes in any way, shape, or form the rights of local governments to exercise their police powers and their land use authority. So I mean, the way the press reported the Sonoma decision did not comport with the appellate court decision from just last month. So
that is correct. In fact, the judge in the Sonoma County case relied upon a 1985 case which predates Prop 215 and the Medical Marijuana Program Act.
Okay. I had another question, but I know my colleagues are jumping at the bit as well, so we'll come back.
It was just a question to follow up on what the mayor had asked as far as profitability, nonprofit, and that. In Sunday's paper, there was an article up in Sonoma County, and it pertained to a grower, and they were doing over $100,000 a year in business. My question is that just an example of somebody not looking, or where does this nonprofit status come to play?
Well, I'm going to preface my response by saying that I haven't looked at the specific tax issues with respect to medical marijuana dispensaries closely. However, the Attorney General guidelines, and again, the Medical Marijuana Program Act, which is codified in the Health and Safety Code, in one of those statutes, it expressly authorizes the Attorney General to come up with additional guidelines. The Attorney General did that, and in fact, in those guidelines expressed that the only lawfully recognized operation of dispensaries must be nonprofit, and that's where we've derived that.
Okay. Mr. Beers? Oh, Mr. Johannesson.
Is the intent of this that only it can be dispensed only to members?
That is correct.
Because I don't think that's what it says. The dispensing operations, which is paragraph 3A on page 6 of the report, the dispensary shall only be authorized to dispense medicinal marijuana to a person with an identification card whom the applicant, that is person's private. Then a person, it's also confusing because a person could include a cooperative. So the dispensary can distribute to a cooperative, but there's no definition of member here. And I think we've got the same issue on the definitions in paragraph 5.2520E. There seems to be kind of a confusion here. If it's for members only, then it seems that paragraph 3A should be modified to say that. And the members meaning they have established residency, which would mean some type of proof of being a West Sacramento resident.
I'm sorry.
No, and in the issue of why a cooperative collective is included in the definition of person.
Well, the way that we have defined a medical marijuana dispensary in this ordinance is, first of all, a dispensary is just is used for ease of reference. But truly, a dispensary must be a collective or a cooperative. And if you look at definition E under 5.25.020, we've provided a definition of what a collective or a cooperative is. And in that definition, it says that it's designed only for members.
And what is a member?
A member of the nonprofit?
But does a member have to be a West Sac resident? See, that's where I'm trying to get to here. I don't.
By virtue of the other sections in this ordinance, the member must be a resident of West Sacramento if they're either dispensing or obtaining medical marijuana. And the reason for that is that there's a health and safety code section that provides that any time you have a primary caregiver that is dispensing medical marijuana to more than 2 persons, that patient and that primary caregiver must reside in the same city or county.
Okay. Another issue is what this is going to be doing, at least proposing to do, is limit this to 2 facilities in West Sacramento. Has anybody checked to see if that's enforceable or not? Do we have the ability to do that, to limit the number of licenses?
I believe that because the ordinance is enforcing this, pardon me, let me rephrase this. This ordinance is an attempt at land use regulation. And the Health and Safety Code provides that cities and local agencies may adopt additional regulations that basically supplement the Medical Marijuana Program Act, which we're doing. There is no case law to the contrary that would limit our ability to adopt a numerical limit on dispensaries.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with all this is that we've got Prop 215 and SB 420 and some opinions from the Attorney General. I mean, we're kind of in uncharted water here. There's not a lot of real strong legal precedents. I mean, the legislature really should clarify this. So I just don't want us to get in a position where we're hung out there and doing something that, I mean, someone could file a lawsuit anytime they want, but, you know, something that would be clearly out of balance in this, I'd like to make sure we address that. The other is, one of my concerns about this would be, I think as other council members have mentioned, is the profit. I mean, there's a lot of people that are getting into this now, and to me that means there's a good purpose for this. Underlying it's a good purpose for this, but they are supposed to be nonprofits, and I don't see anywhere where we have the ability to go and look at books and records, do inventories, to that. Particularly if we decide at some point to have a sales tax override, which Oakland has done. I think they've got a 1.8% to be able to verify what the, what the gross is or whatever the tax is going to be.
Well, Mr. Hance, I want to make sure I understand your question. I think if we had somebody with a use permit that has conditions that are suggested by this ordinance, we have the right to make sure those conditions are being met. So if we are concerned whether they are meeting the conditions of the land use that they maintain nonprofit status, we can look for that. We can get to those kinds of issues. But if the second question is, are they operating legally or not, that's going to get beyond just code enforcement. That's going to get into police issues. If the outright sale of marijuana, in fact, is illegal in California, as the AG suggests, we're not trying to regulate that. It's illegal. Right. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but if we're saying it's going to be a nonprofit organization, we can check to make sure somebody's meeting our code and use permit, just like any other use permit in the city.
Right. Well, I think one of the problems here is, and I think we've talked about this before, is what's going to happen is if there's 2 licenses out there, basically it's a random selection on whoever is selected out of a pool of I don't know how many people are going to apply. So, we potentially, with that system, which I think we should beef that up and maybe look deeper in the selection process, is that we could be randomly select the 2 poorest operators that basically meet the pre-screening qualifications, And my concern is, you know, I think we're doing this for two reasons. One is it's required. I mean, we can't really stop it. We have a right to regulate it to a certain extent. But the other is to protect our citizens, under our authority to protect the health and welfare of our citizens. And what I don't want to see is possibly one of the two coming in turns out to be a laundering operation. And we have the ability to go in and look at financial books and records to be able to determine whether that's happening or not. You know, because there's limits on the amount of inventory that they can have. There's a cross-check with, you know, patient requirements in the inventory to make sure that there's not, you know, 1,000 times the quantity there that the patients need. But there doesn't seem to be a way to get in there and do an audit to see if, you know, laundering going on.
Well, we can certainly look at that, but if I call your attention to page 6, I'm not quite sure I have the section. It's 0603F at the bottom. That's the attempt to begin to address what you're raising, is that, in fact,
right.
We can go and look. They have to keep these records and we can go and look at it.
Right.
Now, whether we'll get it out at all, I don't know. That remains to be seen. But this is the start of that.
Right, but I mean, in paragraph 6 coming up, it's the records that are subject to inspection, review, and audit, and the financial records aren't included in here.
That we could work on.
Councilmember Johannesson, if I may just direct your attention to page 8 under 6B, the dispensary is required to maintain and make available city records that establish that the dispensary is a nonprofit organization.
Well, I mean, a nonprofit is basically an annual report with the Attorney General and tax filings, but it doesn't get into the accounting records. I mean, if I'm looking at this, I'm going to say, well, you know, we're qualified as a nonprofit. Here's the thing we filed with the Attorney General. That's all you get. You know, your ordinance doesn't say books and records. I just would like to see a little bit more here. You know, it's not like we're going to go out and spend a lot of time on this, but if there's a problem, we need a remedy here in the ordinance.
Well, it may be as well. I mean, we you know, in our very first conversation about this, I think Mr. Christoph raised the revenue issue, the Oakland issue. We're not a charter city, so we don't have the authority to impose a special sales tax just on this use. But a business license, gross receipts approach could happen. But we would need all of the data that you're describing in order to implement a gross receipts tax or even to analyze its implications. So I mean, I think it's an important point for that, you know, that's a sequence of what we might consider in the future as well. It is, I mean, we have the authority to say 2 only. I mean, I'm trying to get some of these issues out on the table because I want to encourage folks who are going to, since we have so many folks that want to testify, not to spend their time barking up trees that aren't going to go anywhere. And there are cities throughout California that have said we will allow no more than 2 Starbucks. We will allow no more than 2 Subways. We do have the absolute legal authority to limit the total number of virtually any type of business or land use in our community. That's not affected by Prop 215. And based on what the appellate court said in the Claremont decision, there's nothing else that has. We don't have any less land use authority in this domain than we do with any other, with a Starbucks, just as an example, which dispenses coffee to its members. Am I correct in that, in the assumption that we have that authority?
Yes, you are correct, Mayor Cabaldon, and that is derived from the city's police powers to make those sort of regulations.
Right. Okay. And Prop 215, which we've considered here a couple of times, provides an immunity from prosecution. Does not establish an absolute right without restrictions to get access to medical marijuana. I mean, there's nothing in the initiative or in the implementing statute that establishes that there's a constitutional right at all, as a matter of convenience to be able to obtain it. We're trying to deal with this issue so that it's possible, but it's not the default position. If we take no action at all, there's no potential lawsuit that somebody could file that would require us to allow dispensaries to operate without regulation.
That is correct.
Okay. And we have one other option before us, and I want to make this clear because most of the mail I've been getting has been from folks who have either dispensary operators or from folks whose primary interest is quite explicit at the beginning, which is this, we want to legalize, and this is the first step to do that. That's not what this conversation is about. We're trying to develop a rational policy that serves the health needs of folks in our community and protects the interests of our community in a very uncertain environment, both on a regulatory basis, but also on a business basis. There's no good record in California yet of how to do this business model. I mean, there's LA and Sacramento and other places that have lots of essentially unregulated operations, but that's not what we're not trying to replicate that. We're trying to figure that on behalf of patients and our community. So I'm just trying to establish that if we can't come to a resolution on this, I mean, I have to say for myself at least, if we can't find an ordinance tonight and in our next meeting that we can vote for that accomplishes many of the things that I know folks in dispensaries don't like, then for me, the next step, the backup plan isn't to say, well, let's just pass an ordinance that allows them an unlimited number, any place with profit and sales and storefronts and freeway signs. That's not alternative number two. Alternative number two is we will extend the moratorium for the maximum amount of time and let the courts and other cities figure this out, and we'll come back to it later. To me, that's the next best alternative. So I want to say that at the outset, so that folks who are not under the impression that there, at least I don't think there's a council majority that's preparing to say, if we don't adopt any of these restrictions that folks don't like, that we're just going to say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, because I don't think that's not the direction that the council has given in its prior meetings, and I don't think that's the position that we want to take West Sacramento into. We're a small community trying to do the best that we can for our public safety and for health, and we'll do the best that we can. If we can't come to a solution, we will have to let others chart that path for us. So, right, are there other questions of staff or the city attorney at this time?
You have a lot on.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Okay, so I have several cards. So what I'll do is call the speaker, and then I'll call I'll let you know who's going to be the next speaker. So if you can sort of make your way to the aisle or what have you, so you're prepared to come forward, that'll minimize the transition time. Again, we do have a 3-minute limit. And if you if you can pay attention to the comments that others are making, and if they're identical to yours, you just say I agree with so-and-so's comment as opposed to repeating the entire thing. We want to make sure that everybody has a chance to be heard. We know some folks have kids at home that they've got to get home to, and we want to give them an opportunity to be heard as well. So the first is Sherry Barr on behalf of City and County of Trees Patient Care.
Good evening. Excuse me. I just want to end up saying that I give these two people over here kudos for doing such an excellent job on this ordinance. I look at this ordinance and they gave me the opportunity to participate, give my background. I've been a dispensary owner almost 4 years because of my husband having cancer. I'm just like what you said, that's me. I've been doing that for 4 years. When Steve sent me the ordinance, and I'm going to try not to cry, I looked at this, and in the one section, which was the dispensing operations, which is page 6. On the back part, H, I, J, the whole thing, that's me. I've been a primary caregiver. My City of Woodland business license just expired in October. I've had that for 3 years. My state seller's permit. This is a total caregivership for me. I grow the plants for my patients. I have an allotment program. I have one patient that's been with me for 3 years, and it's almost like welfare. And I don't grow all the plants for each patient. That's not what I'm about. It's about the patient to me. Just like how you said, how are you going to regulate this? I have a whole book here that will tell you how I have transpired just this one little product and have made 7 different jobs out of it to bring to this area. Residents, you can take, just like you do for the care program for the PG&E bill, I could caregive for them to where they get a percentage each month.
That's how it's supposed to work. That's how your caregiver is supposed to be. You're supposed to grow for your patients. In return, okay, your patients are allowed so many plants. Well, I might only grow one plant, but that patient is still going to guarantee that allotment. And if I go through, say I only do one grow, and that patient I'm still caregiving for, that patient is still getting that allotment every single month, no matter what. So in response to this, and I just want to end up saying, I am the one person that you said that you don't know about the law. I just got off of criminal charges on Thursday in Woodland. I was wrongfully raided. I had all my paperwork where my business was zoned. I was in the right zoning. I had all the right paperwork.
I do need to ask you to come to conclusion.
Okay. I just want to end up saying that all my criminal charges have been dropped, and I do give you kudos for what you did. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Barr. Peter Kais, who will be followed by Craig Litwin.
Good evening, Mayor Cabaldon, distinguished members of the council. I'd like to thank you for hearing this subject. I've been looking at the brand new draft of the ordinance that came out a couple of days ago. I'd just like to make a few brief comments on the new things that are coming up on there. I'd like to hear more about why you want to prohibit processing, what it is about processing that's concerning the council and why that should be prohibited. I think the ban on cultivation is misguided. I think patients should be able to trade plants amongst themselves, and I think the dispensary is the proper hub for that to occur at. You seem to be concerned about tobacco all of a sudden. I don't think there's any reason why chewing tobacco should be prohibited. I don't think there's any reason why religious consumption of tobacco tea should be prohibited. I also don't see why smoking tobacco outside the dispensary, 20 feet away from the doors or whatever, should be prohibited. I'm not sure what the concern is there. Accordingly, I don't think consumption of cannabis should be prohibited either. I think, first of all, eating it, isn't going to hurt the neighbor. Smoking it, I don't think should be prohibited. I think that's probably the best place for people to be smoking cannabis, is at the dispensary, away from society, away from anybody who might be disturbed by that conduct. I appreciate you having one stakeholder meeting. I'm going to advise having one more because I haven't seen any of the anything from the stakeholder meeting implemented in the ordinance yet. I don't know if we can expect to see any of our suggestions taken seriously at this point or put into the ordinance, but your council representative has said tonight she's confident that the ordinance before you is legally proper. I beg to differ. There are many issues legally with this ordinance. Most of them have been brought up before this council or the Planning Commission already, so I won't repeat any of those. I just want to close with a question: is and it can be redundant, but when will we see some of the inputs from the stakeholders reflected in the ordinance? Thank you.
Thanks. All right, Craig Litwin, followed by James Anthony.
Thank you very much. Mayor, council members, members of staff, I appreciate the opportunity to speak before you here this evening. My name is Craig Litwin. I'm a former mayor from the city of Sebastopol, California, and I was the co-author of our successful dispensary ordinance out there. We limit our dispensaries to 2. You are entitled to do that. Don't worry at all about limiting the number. I'd suggest 3. Just because I think for a city your size and sphere of influence, it'd be more appropriate. I have 3 suggestions that I've made before that I'm going to reiterate briefly, and I also have 5 additional. Sensitive or dispensaries, really you need to be serving all patients in California. I think this is your biggest liability to a lawsuit. If you restrict it just to West Sacramento residents, I've never heard of another industry that does that. California patients need to have access to the medicine. But I think you can have your controls with your nonprofit by examining the books. You can have your controls with the number by limiting the number of dispensaries. Secondly, the state mandated, or a mandate that the state ID card be required. It seems like another potential lawsuit that you can be put under if you make that a requirement. It doesn't. It's voluntary, so to legislate otherwise would really be uncharted water. Thirdly, I mentioned already you should allow for 3 dispensaries, but it should be in a competitive process. You really don't want just random dispensary applicants coming forward and you get whatever however the coin flips. So quickly here, and I'll put these in writing for the record, especially if I don't get through them at this point. I think you should have a sensitive use variance. We have that in our ordinance, so that way if it's close to a sensitive use, but it's within, maybe it's a little closer than it should be, but it's adequately buffered, it allows your city the flexibility that you need. Secondly, dispensaries should be able to sell plants to their patients. Thirdly, I would not mandate that the medicine container possess a label of the patient's information. That seems to be getting, it adds unnecessary burdens, and also privacy issues come up. Fourthly, there should be a zero tolerance policy from the dispensary. If any of their patients divert medicine or consume on site, if you keep that in the ordinance, then they should be banned from the dispensary immediately. We have that provision in our ordinance. And lastly, you have in your newest draft of the ordinance that the police chief should have the name of the person to help with any public relations. In our ordinance and others that I've seen, you can also provide that the dispensary supply that to everyone within, say, 100 feet of the dispensaries, so neighbors can be talking directly to each other, making sure to take care of things that don't have to come before the council. Thank you.
Somebody who's experienced with 3-minute rules, right on time. James Anthony, followed by David Brock.
Good evening, Honorable Mayor, newly elected Mayor Pro Tem, members of the council. My name is James Anthony. I'm a land use attorney and a former city attorney, a community prosecutor for the city of Oakland, where I worked on problem properties of various kinds. For the last 4 years, much of my private practice has been devoted to working with medical cannabis collectives and with local regulators to achieve functional, harmonious, reasonable regulations that are a win-win-win for the patients, the community, and the city staff that has to implement, oversee, and enforce those regulations. I also ran the zoning initiative campaign in Berkeley last November that resulted in their unique and very successful approach. And I also drafted the Oakland tax measure, which was in fact a gross receipts business tax, not a sales tax override. So straightforward gross receipts, $18 per $1,000 of gross receipts. I am at this point a medical cannabis movement lawyer and, strangely enough, a former city attorney. And as I mentioned, not only do I work and have worked consistently for years for this win-win-win situation, I've seen it happen all over the state of California. I've won permits from the sheriff coroner of Kern County and the outskirts of the city of Bakersfield. We've worked in eastern LA County in cities as small as a Diamond Bar, certainly in the Bay Area, in Oakland, where we have a very successful regulatory system, 4 licensed dispensaries there, with some consideration for increasing that number. San Francisco, unincorporated Contra Costa County has legal medical cannabis dispensaries. Certainly Sonoma, Sebastopol, Santa Rosa. So there are workable models out there despite the appalling conditions in Los Angeles, and I'm very, very hopeful for your neighbor across the river. And I hope that here too that we'll be able to work together, and I in fact owe some communication to your city attorney as part of a discussion that we started at the Planning Commission last week. So thank you for addressing this issue. Let me say that your current draft is problematic, as you will hear over and over again, specifically the residency requirement, the caregiver's requirement, the ID card requirement are all subject to challenge. Though that's not the kind of work I do, I prefer to try to work these things out before they're passed. I will say I have noticed an uptick in litigation lately. There are some very serious law firms that are now defending medical cannabis rights. Wendell Rosen from Oakland, which is a major Northern California land use firm, is in cases all over Northern California. Roberts Elliott from San Jose just won a preliminary injunction. I'd never seen a city defeated on preliminary injunction before. That was yesterday in San Jose, or Santa Clara County Superior Court, city of Gilroy. Just to finish up, if you're interested, the AG's guidelines do not prohibit sales. They clearly permit storefront operation, and if that's not sales, I'm not sure what is. They do say that you can't sell to non-members, and nobody is talking about that. In any case, I look forward to working with you and continuing this discussion, and I'm available to you if you have any questions.
All right, thank you. David Brock will be followed by Ryan Landers.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, City Council. My name is David Brock. I'd like to address the council as a health lawyer, resident of West Sacramento, and also general counsel for West Sac Wellness Incorporated, a prospective applicant.
Mr. Brock, you're taller than our previous witnesses. There's a button at your right hand that will raise the entire podium, including the microphone, closer so that folks in the audience and at home can hear what you have to say.
Is that better? Is that better?
That's better.
Okay, very good.
Thanks.
I get credit on my time? Quite all right. Okay. No, I would like to first just briefly reiterate some of the comments made by James Anthony earlier. I do think that the current draft ordinance is problematic, specifically with regard to the residency requirement. Mr. Mayor, you're absolutely correct. The Compassionate Use Act does not provide patients or their caregivers with a statutory right to consume marijuana. It's not a right, it's a privilege. The right that is implicated, though, however, by the residency requirement, and this is a right that's been actually recognized by the courts and acknowledged by the Attorney General's office, is the right of people who are privileged to consume marijuana for medicinal purposes to freely associate with each other. Those rights are funded in, excuse me, well-established principles of constitutional law, both under the First Amendment and the Substantive Due Process Clause. And if the ordinance were to proceed with the residency requirement intact, it is all but inevitable that there would be some type of legal challenge against the ordinance. It would be costly, it would be messy. As a business lawyer, I'm somewhat similar to Mr. Anthony because my objective is to try to keep clients out of litigation. So as a resident of West Sacramento, I do not believe that would be a prudent use of the city's resources. Briefly about the taxation issue, the Board of Equalization has acknowledged that the sale of medicinal marijuana within the context of collective and cooperative organizations is a taxable event subject to sales tax. It's not logically possible to impose a sales tax unless the transaction represents a sale, ergo, it is a sale. One other point I'd like to briefly touch on is came up at the Planning Commission meeting on December 3rd, which was the question of whether or not this was a business or a service. The truth is, it's actually a combination of both. It is organized not for profit, but as with any other enterprise, there has to be enough revenue generated to cover the cost. Otherwise, the business will not be there to provide the service. If the residency requirement is left intact, the potential patient base would not be sufficient to accomplish that objective, and the service would not be available, resulting in essentially a de facto ban, which I don't think is the intention of the city. Thank you very much.
Thank
I'm
you,
happy
Mr.
to answer
Brock.
any questions you might have.
Thank you. Ryan Landers, who will be followed by Nikos Leverins.
I have all my notes here. In common with the last two speakers, I too am here to help you not get sued, but help the city the community and the sick people in your community. My name is Ryan Landers, and I help create and qualify and pass Proposition 215. I was the spokesperson for Sacramento to pass the law, and I was asked onto the Attorney General's task force for the Senate Bill 420, which is the ID card bill. You cannot require a patient to get an ID card. We have seen, I fought for the records to be concealed or destroyed, similar to San Francisco, and that was the agreement, and they took your name off the card. The anonymity is important because there can be a large abuse of the records. And we've seen people lose their driver's license with no tickets, no accidents, and the only thing they did was get an ID card from the state saying they can grow and smoke medical marijuana. I think all of you are very reasonable people, and I can't see one of you saying, you live across the street from the city. Too bad. If you can't drive to Sacramento, you have to suffer and die. What you're doing here is something that we can work out. We will help you prevent litigation. That's what we're here for. We have the facts, we have the knowledge, we have years of knowledge. But are you going to ask an old lady to go to a head shop and go to the back room of a tobacco store and get a pipe? I would suggest not. I would say that a small amount of pipes and consumable materials such as papers and especially vaporizers should be allowed on site, not a large display, of $300, water pipes, but something reasonable for the patients, because we're not talking about marijuana to get high. We're talking about marijuana to stop people from throwing up, to make them eat, and to make them survive. You have to be consistent. This is the thing that you're not seeming to hear. You have to be consistent with Proposition 215 and Senate Bill 420. More Senate Bill 420 because we can't rewrite anything in Proposition 215 on the state level. The Attorney General can't guide people on that level, and on that level it says you can't redistribute marijuana to a non-medical use. It never says patients can't work together and get their marijuana. And the randomness, the random selection, that's the best way to get the worst operator. And the patient records are very important. It's very important for patients to have a chance to qualify. In SB 420, a qualified patient is a person with a recommendation. So they would qualify for the card. I understand the HIPAA issues, and I think there's another way we can address not violating HIPAA. And I know I'm out of time. There was one.
You actually are out of time. Thank you, Mr. Landers.
Just remember that we're helping the sick, and we can do things if there's a problem, but randomly selecting somebody out of a hat that was there first is a quick danger. And I understand you guys, we don't want to do it if it's going to violate the law this way. Well, there's ways to work around it.
Mr. Landers, I need to cut you off. Thank you. Nikos Leverins will be followed by Nick Street.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members. My name is Nikos Leverins. I'm speaking on behalf of myself tonight, although I have provided testimony before the state legislature, other city councils, and the Board of Supervisors on medical marijuana, harm reduction, and other criminal justice reform measures. I congratulate you for having an open, transparent, and deliberative process here that seeks public input from stakeholders, from patients, and from outsiders like me. I think it's very important and it shows good faith on your part, and I commend you for that. I would like to underscore the prior criticisms regarding the residency requirements and making SB 420 voluntary. Particularly with respect to the residency requirements, that opens up the avenue for a broad equal protection challenge. As we move forward with this ordinance, it's important, that we're here because we need to put patients first. This is not about, decriminalizing marijuana. This is about giving, people in need of relief needed relief in terms of the medication. And medical cannabis dispensaries are a way for people suffering from serious illnesses like HIV/AIDS and from chronic pain, needed medication. What patients need is the legal and operational clarity and flexibility in an ordinance that will allow them to access the needed medication and the health services that come with that needed medication. I'm familiar with one collective in Sacramento that provides a whole range of services ranging from peer-to-peer counseling, licensed acupuncture, counseling, and what have you, exercise classes, garden classes, cooking classes. This is a community. This shouldn't be viewed as strictly as a retail operation, even though the State Board of Equalization already views it as a a transfer of tangible personal property. So as we move forward, I think the city of Sacramento West Sacramento has a real opportunity to develop a baseline here in the way that other people perceive this community. And if it puts patients first, it will be telling people that West Sacramento is a safe, welcoming, and compassionate city. And it can also do so in a way that strengthens your underlying public fisc. And hopefully in the future, we won't be having discussions about needing to furlough people because the money is not there. I thank you very much for the opportunity for letting me testify tonight, and I look forward to working with you all in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Leverins. Nick Street will be followed by Sinise Agarwal.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Nicholas Street. I'm the president and co-founder of Sacramento Nonprofit Collective. I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to speak before you today. I agree with many of the previous speakers, so I'll try not to be too redundant. But I must encourage that there really does need to be a competitive process for dispensary operators. The city of Oakland has successfully had a numerical ranking system in the past, and that's something that you should really, consider adopting some sort of system for that. It seems like all this proactive work that you're doing now would almost be contradictory if you got the wrong type of operators in place for that. I agree again with Mr. Litwin in the fact that all California patients should be able to receive medicine at any dispensary within the state of California. It's especially here in West Sacramento, there are no dispensaries in many neighboring cities such as Davis and Woodland. So you're asking these patients to drive through West Sacramento to get to a dispensary, say in Sacramento or another region. You also have the issue of people visiting West Sacramento, working in West Sacramento, things of that nature. You can't really tell an individual when they need to obtain their medicine and when not to. Again, with the state ID card, I think you guys have heard pretty much all you need to hear on that issue. I'll just kind of briefly go into the fact that in this economy right now, it's hard for individuals to be put in a burden of having to drive excess of miles with the gas prices that they are and spend extra money on an additional expense for a state ID card. So, these patients that are using the medicinal marijuana, they're not in a great financial position, all of them. So it is important that you take that into consideration when drafting this ordinance. I'd like to, again, thank all you members for all your time and consideration, especially the members of the Planning Commission earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Sinise Agarwal will be followed by Tyler O'Brien.
My name is Sunit Agarwal. I'm a resident of West Sacramento for 5 years and the executive director of El Camino Wellness Center, a nonprofit medical cannabis dispensing collective in SAC. Thanks to everybody for working on this and giving us the opportunity to speak. We currently donate money to groups, feed neighborhoods and lower income sections of town, dispense free medicine to low income patients, and offer free services to collective members, such as what Mr. Leverins discussed. All our medicine are tested by a laboratory to screen for molds and pathogens. Our location is clean and bright. We gladly pay sales tax in Sacramento, and any of you guys are welcome to come see us anytime. I do plan on applying for a permit once the process begins, but the same points that everybody else brought up will make it pretty difficult to operate. The state ID card is a extra expense for many of these low-income patients, as Mr. Street said. the patients being only members, only residents of West Sacramento, I mean, I just don't think that there'll be opportunity for any business to really operate, pay wages, pay rent, pay tax. You know, we give every employee that works for us full health care and all their benefits. You just really can't do that by limiting who can come in there based on where they live. The medicine container containing identification information is also a burden that would make it more difficult to operate as well. It leads into privacy issues for patients. Dispensaries should be able to sell plants to patient collective members for their cultivation needs, and the ordinance should explicitly state this. I mean, I think patients should be able to grow medicine for themselves. So based on those points, on an operational standpoint, no dispensary will be able to operate paying employees workman's comp taxes with the proposed ordinance. And finally, I'm excited that our city has a chance to make a model ordinance that they can replicate. And thanks for what you guys are doing. Stronger regulations are how medical cannabis dispensaries make the system better than forcing a bunch of people to hide in the shadows. So thanks again, guys.
Thank you. I just want to mark, I think that was our first BlackBerry testimony in the history of the city. I've never seen that before. Tyler O'Brien, who'll be followed by Bill Lowell.
Mr. Mayor, council members, thank you. My name is Tyler O'Brien. I served as a third-class petty officer in the United States Navy. I also served in the War Enduring Freedom and proudly fought for our country's freedom in Afghanistan. As I was wounded by enemy gunfire while protecting our freedoms, I'm currently a medical marijuana patient, not only for the injuries that I suffered, but for post-traumatic stress syndrome that I now have after the war. The other medications prescribed by my doctor have serious long and short-term effects on myself, my body, and my well-being in my life. Upon returning home, it's been extremely difficult for me to find consistent employment, and now our economy makes it very hard for me to support myself and my son. I'm currently living in Davis and going to school, living on grants and loans for school, and trying to support myself and my son. A medical marijuana dispensary or dispensaries in West Sacramento would make things much easier for me. I won't have to drive through your city to go to other dispensaries in Sacramento or other areas. I'm also procuring work here in West Sacramento. So as Mr. Street and I believe some of the other speakers have said, driving to West Sacramento here to work would still prohibit me from getting my medicine here in West Sacramento, even though I am part of the community and the city is, you know, working and being here. I can go to the 7-Eleven and use my money there, but I couldn't go get my medicine and help this community with the economy because I don't actually live here in this town. So this would mean I'd have to travel through your city to other cities, which would cost me money as far as gas and things of that nature, and just take away time from my son and my studies just to procure medication. I also think, you know, I'd urge you to allow all California patients to go to any dispensary, you know, in the California area. It just makes more sense to me, especially with the economy, if I can come here to West Sacramento to work and get my medicine, it helps the economy here in West Sacramento rather than me driving through town to go somewhere else. Also, the ID card strikes an issue with me as far as an extra added cost that I have to pay to procure my medicine. I already have school, have to pay, you know, for my actual prescription itself, and then to procure another form of identification costs me more monies, is getting kind of, you know, digging into the pockets. Lastly, as I've become a medical marijuana patient, I've been to a number of different dispensaries here in Sacramento. I've seen a lot of dispensaries that hold themselves in high regard in a very professional manner, very clean and professional, and go about business as an actual business. And I've also been into some that do not hold themselves in such high regard. So that would pertain to the process of just randomly selecting one out of a hat. I think that a more competitive process is better for your city, the dispensaries itself, and also the patients. I also want to thank you for your time, and thank you for all your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. And Bill Lowell.
Thank you again, Mr. Mayor. William Lowell again for the record. I think it was over the weekend, I saw about what appeared to be a half-page article on Saturday or Sunday's paper about how they were growing it right and left up there in up in Humboldt County, and they were planning on selling it for, I'm sure it was over $100 an ounce, and I'm thinking about, whenever I hear this term nonprofit status, it really gets under my skin, because all you have to do is make sure the CEOs of a nonprofit corporation are paid high enough to where there's no profit. So that kind of thing has to be examined also. And let's see. So if our medical marijuana ordinance were revived, maybe sales tax revenues, the cure from the sales, whatever, the revenues could solve the various cities' problems, the financial problems. But of course, I'm sure that would create a lot more problems in the abuse and all that kind of thing. So it's a very touchy issue, and I don't envy you. Thank you.
All right, that concludes the public testimony on item 18. So, Mr. Ricola?
Yes, thank you,
additional
Mr. Mayor.
information.
Based on the testimony that we heard tonight, the issues really break down to 3 issues, and we'd like to address them. The issues were pre-selection, the residency requirement, and ID, and I will address the first issue, and Ms. Ibrahimi will address the 2. There was a lot of talk tonight about developing a competitive process, and a lot of reference to the City of Oakland's point reviewing system. And the point that I think has not been made clear is that rather than providing points, such as the City of Oakland does through their competitive ranking system, and make a subjective determination based on the information that provides, we require all the applicants in 525-040B, we set forth 5 very objective standards, including felony convictions, what the locational standards, and then we also require the applicant to address to our satisfaction each of the operating conditions that are in the ordinance. So to be considered for an application, you need to address and meet all 5 of those standards. And we think that is a preferable process. Now, it is true, should there be applications that 2 or more that meet those standards, then yes, we would need to make a random selection. But we think we've set the bar high by the standards that we've addressed. So, Mona, would you like to address the other 2?
Mr. Johannesson, just on the specific
Are we
issue.
going to take comments as we go through each? Steve, it's, I think probably the problem with that is these are someone who has never operated a dispensary could meet these 5 requirements, because there's no look at track history. And one of the things we've got to look at is how this affects the image of West Sacramento. It's not just, wanting to do the right thing if we can do that in this context, but to not have a less than professional facility, because these things can range anywhere from what would look like a doctor's office, very, very professional, to, whatever. And these criteria don't reflect that. So you're not really looking at a history. And I would say that, yeah, this is the first step, but the next step should be, well, what have you done? Where have you operated before? How did your operation go? Did you have any problems? How were your, and those kind of questions. Because really, it's how this business can fit into West Sacramento. And if they meet all these requirements, what about landlord complaints? It's not here. So you have someone that's got a significant amount of complaints in the neighborhood. It's not asked, they're put in their hat, and they're drawn out, and that's what we get. So that's kind of the problem with this approach.
And certainly that's a policy option for the council. It's just that in our draft, we wanted to stick to objective criteria where there was no debate on the issues. And we think we've set the bar fairly high by doing so. But once again, we appreciate your response and direction.
If I may just add to
Right, you have
Councilmember.
additional issues that were raised that you were going to address, or was that the final one?
No, there were 3 issues
Right,
overall,
okay.
Mr.
So why don't we
Mayor.
complete that?
The
Then we'll-
ID
then we'll
card
come to
and
council questions and
residency, and I
comments,
just
yeah.
talked about the issue regarding pre-selection.
And if I just may add to what Steve had said previously about the pre-selection criteria, upon further reflection and Planning Commission direction, we did revise the ordinance to also require that an applicant shall not have had a license or a permit for a medical marijuana dispensary previously revoked, suspended, or denied for good cause. But I believe that in the course of crafting this ordinance, one of the considerations previously was that there could have been a potential applicant who had never operated a dispensary but had showed just stellar qualification, and we didn't necessarily want to preclude that. So that was one of my understandings for that particular matter. But I'd also like to, and there were several other comments made with respect to some of the policy decisions, and that's certainly within the purview of this council to modify anything in this ordinance to that extent. With respect to the residency requirement,
Just let me check, are your presentations right now coordinated? Or?
Yes, they
Okay.
are. Yes, yes, very much so.
Okay, so you're both moving on to the residency requirement now?
yes, we
Okay.
are. With respect to residency, Health and Safety Code Section 11362.7D2, again, that really expresses that any time a primary caregiver is dispensing or providing medical marijuana to more than one patient, that those patients and the primary caregiver must reside in the same city or the county.
What's that
and
code
this-
section? Can you say the code section again?
Yes, that's 11362.7, subsection D2.
E2 or D2?
D.
Okay, great, thanks.
And I'd just like to clarify that this ordinance is not precluding a patient from obtaining medical marijuana from outside of West Sacramento, and this only really applies to those persons who are obtaining medical marijuana from dispensaries. So as long as they're getting it from their own private primary caregiver, this ordinance does not regulate that. Moving on to the issue of identification cards. Again, this ordinance is not regulating patients who elect to receive medical marijuana from their private primary caregivers. It does not require that they have to get an identification card. It simply requires that those persons who are obtaining medical marijuana from one of these 2 dispensaries to have an identification card. And my understanding is that that was intended for 2 purposes, one of which was to help law enforcement, and one of them was to help patients. And I'll expand a little bit more on that. In order to have, when you have an identification card program, first of all, that's a statewide program, and the county issues the identification card after a thorough review of an application and upon confirming that the patient has a physician's recommendation. And it also provides a 24-hour verification telephone number and an expiration date. Again, this is intended for law enforcement to easily be able to enforce this. The benefit to patients in having an identification card is that the Medical Marijuana Program Act expressly provides in section 11362.71E that no person or designated primary caregiver in possession of a valid state medical marijuana ID card shall be subject to arrest for possession, transportation, delivery, or cultivation of medical marijuana. So the way that this ordinance was crafted, it was intended to benefit both patients as well as law enforcement. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, just one additional area. Here addressing the council, we did receive 2 comments that were written comments from members of the audience who do not wish to address the council but want to identify their extreme opposition to the proposed ordinance because of the belief that the ordinance will result in increased graffiti, gang use, potential drug dealing, insolence, and other issues if an ordinance is in fact adopted. So the comments were ask to be entered into the record through written comments.
All right. Just on this ID card issue, right? So it's voluntary to get one, but we have plenty of regulations and ordinances that require, for example, a driver's license to be displayed by folks in various course of business with the city, just as an example, or with businesses. We require that you provide that form of identification to a motel when you register so that we can verify information that we are interested in with respect to our motel regulatory. And the driver's license itself is voluntary. No one's required under state law to obtain one. But we have always had the legal right to require it to be displayed, right, in other courses of business that we regulate. So I'm trying to understand the distinction, because what was said during much of the testimony was that you can't regulate it because the state says that patients don't have to get it. But I want to tease that issue out to see whether whether there's something unique about this ID card that's not applicable to all the other things in the world that are voluntary in the state, but that we do require here in local ordinances, and that's common across jurisdictions throughout the state.
Well, the Health and Safety Code provides that a patient need not necessarily have an identification card in order to obtain, use, or cultivate medical marijuana. However, this ordinance is a land use regulation. The city is entitled through its police powers to add additional operational requirements, one of which is an identification card, which further it's intended to further the public health, safety, and welfare for ID purposes, for enforcement purposes, and for patient rights.
Okay. Mr. Johannesson?
Yeah, just one comment on the ID cards is the way this is dispensed is basically you have a doctor recommendation, it's not considered a prescription. And the way the ID cards are, the ID card could actually expire after the recommendation expires. And so you have that kind of issue that even though someone has an identification card, they don't have no valid recommendation for it. The ID card is really, I think, helps law enforcement. It's a quicker way to verify who should have what. So that's going to be an issue, that if there is an adoption of using ID cards, then it may not be that the person really has a legitimate right to have that stuff.
All right. Other questions for staff?
Yeah, I do.
Mr. Christoph.
Steve, where does the product come from? I mean, it's if somebody has a license and somebody has the opportunity to go in and to purchase this product, they're allowed so many plants, or possibly can be allowed so many plants. So where does all the product come from? I mean, I look at the television, or I look at the newspaper, or whatever it is, and I see jars, rows and rows and rows of this stuff. Where does it all come from? And is it coming from someplace that is, for lack of better terms, legally acceptable for it to come from?
Well, Mr. Christoph, that's a very good question, and I've actually visited a dispensary and asked that very question. And when the question, I'll give you a question that's just based on information that was obtained by visiting a dispensary and asking the issue. And what I was told is it comes from a variety of sources. An individual dispensary may obtain their medical marijuana from several sources. In terms of the product itself.
So if they're getting it from several sources, how did they get the permission to grow it?
The Medical Marijuana Program Act allows patients and primary caregivers to cultivate medical marijuana and process it. While this ordinance regulates dispensaries and only allows the dispensing of medical marijuana, it does not regulate, and it prohibits, in fact, the processing and cultivation of marijuana within the facility. However, patients and qualified caregivers can form to grow either their own or for their patients plants for medicinal use.
There was one additional question.
But if this is truly nonprofit, something doesn't pass the smell test. I mean, I think that, what everybody is really sort of avoiding is that 200-pound gorilla that's in the room, how can you have a city like Los Angeles that has 11 or 12 dispensaries a number of years ago, and all of a sudden Holder says something as far as, well, we're really going to sort of wink and nod and look the other way, and now you get 1,000 dispensaries. How is it possible that there is not some underground activity or something? I mean, if somebody wants to go and strictly give it to the health needs of patients, that's one thing. But it's something completely different when it really gets above and beyond all that. And I mean, I think that, everybody in the room would acknowledge that, there is something going on. Now, some of those folks can explain it. I can't explain it. I don't know what it is. But I'm certain that there are people in law enforcement that can come and testify and say exactly what it is. But, I just don't know. So I guess what I'm asking is where does this product come from so that it can, in turn, we can put together an ordinance that really makes some sense if we're truly trying to help just the healthy people.
Mr. Ricola, I understand that you have, I just want to note for members of,
This is just a workshop, so
it's
you
not
can come
appropriate
back.
to, we're in a conversation with our staff at the moment, so please refrain from external communications at this point. So if you don't know, let us know, but the answer to Mr. Christoph's question.
Your Honor, Lieutenant Delaney, the police department.
Okay.
I'm working with
You want to come up here, Lieutenant?
Voice will project a little bit better with the microphone, excuse me. My name is David Delaney. I'm a lieutenant with the police department. I've been working with staff in regard to this ordinance. In regards to your question, it is a good question as where the product comes from. It would really depend on the particular organization. And as Ms. Ibrahimi stated, that they can come together to grow.
No, this all has to be in connection with nonprofit now.
That's correct.
Okay.
And so to really answer that question, there may need to be something worked in addition to the ordinance that would provide a checks and balances to ensure that the number of plants were acceptable for the number of patients that were being provided for, so that you could really, if you wanted to screw it down to that level, to be able to determine where it comes from, because it is a very good question.
Okay, yeah, okay, well, that's good, because that leads me to, if this is a workshop, some kind of staff direction. Okay, Steve? Okay, Steve?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I guess for me, the ordinance is okay, but I would like to see it strengthened. When I looked through this, and when we had our initial discussions a few months, or I guess a month ago, I had talked about some additional enforcement, and I don't see that additional enforcement or any of those concepts put into what the ordinance came out to be. Number one, I think that someone with police powers and someone that is funded through either the business license process or some kind of tax process, and nothing that would require a 218 election, but somebody that could be funded through this, so that they can, number one, they can look at prescriptions, they can look at the ID, and they can make sure that they are West Sacramento residents. And then, and I'm looking for somebody with police powers, because I think it's people with police powers that can access that kind of information. I don't think you could send a staff person from community development in order to go do that. And I realize that you talk about some of the folks that can go there, but you talk about police, fire, and so forth. But I would think that I would like to have this ordinance generate enough revenue to hire a police officer that can take and go through each and every person that goes into that dispensary to verify that there are health needs, to verify that they are West Sacramento residents, and to make sure that you know, the product is actually being used for what everybody wants to have it used for, and that's health purposes. But that's for me for the workshop.
Mr. Mayor, could I just react to that one thing, just to put it on the record for the council? I understand the issue, but there are other provisions in the draft with respect to the numbers of these that run countervailing to that. How much would you charge 2 dispensaries, if that's what it is, in order to call that out? So that's just another issue for the council perhaps to discuss.
Yeah, and I understand that. I mean, I think that we can reasonably look at how long it takes an officer to go through. I mean, it depends on how many sick people we have here. I mean, if we've got a whole lot of sick people that need this product that are from West Sacramento, then, you know, it's going to take a longer time. If not, it may not take as long. There may only be, you know, a few. But, you know, I think that, you know, that's pretty much where I'd really sort of like to come from. I'd like to really strengthen it up from a law enforcement perspective.
I mean, the policy issue is going to be, we can't simultaneously maximize, we can't simultaneously say West Sac residents only and 2 dispensaries only and maximize the revenue to any significant degree. I mean, that's, even the Oakland dispensaries, which don't have those restrictions and serve a much larger metropolitan area, I mean, they generate money, but it's not a huge amount of money. It's not, and if the city hired somebody to go and do all of that, it certainly would eat up all that revenue. So that's the policy challenge is we can probably only optimize on one or the other of those. I mean, I just want to say, I was one of the supporters of bringing this forward early on, and you know, the testimony that we heard tonight from Tyler O'Brien and from, in particular, but several others around the health needs are really compelling. I mean, it's an issue that and that we've heard at prior hearings from patients, from residents in our community and nearby who are struggling, and this is the best available medication to deal with their challenges. And it's a hugely uncertain legal environment for everyone involved. You know, everybody that's doing this, either dispensing or relying on the product or whatever, or cultivating, and everyone's involved in a lot of legal ambiguity, creates a lot of problems. And so, I think our efforts was, and I've been very supportive of trying to develop an ordinance that would make it possible, create a path for those patients in our community to be served. Even though, you know, I had to argue with the lieutenant at the last session about the California Police Chief's conclusions around a lot of these issues. And I was prepared to come tonight and take issue with some elements of the draft ordinance and figure out ways that I thought it might be improved. I'm not convinced that 2 versus 3 is, you know, the magic number, and the location map, it may not be perfect, and some issues around variances. I think the Sebastopol testimony you heard, you know, something to look at. The whole random selection issue is one I'm interested in talking about. The wraparound, the notion that Mr. Leverins raised around, you know, wraparound services and other things that might be done at these facilities, you know, resonates with me as an issue to be dealt with. And the whole question around place of employment. I pick up my prescriptions close to where I work because that's when it's open, as opposed to close to my home. So I get that issue, but so and I'm prepared to say that, you know, if we can do some of those things, and I'm sure my colleagues had other ideas, and I'd be prepared to vote for this in January. And then the attorneys got in the room, and I have to say, at this point, I'm not sure I can vote for this ordinance. And that, as I said earlier this evening, if I can't vote for this ordinance, It's because of all these legal threats. And around issues that are critical. To me, the ID card is not really, that's an important issue to me. The West Sac residency issue is important, although I think some tweaks are possible. And if it really is the case, as we've heard from the attorneys and some of the advocates, that putting those in our ordinance means we're going to be the poster child and the test case for a flood of litigation, then my view is we're not a city that can afford to do that. We don't have the money to get involved in that kind of litigation. We don't have the time. We don't have the staff resources. And that the next best option is to say, let's adopt no ordinance and extend the moratorium until July of 2011, pursuant to our legal authority. So no dispensaries would be allowed. I think that would be a tragic outcome. And it would be entirely at the feet of those who want an ordinance that lines up perfectly with their view of the world, and who have taken what is in Prop 215 and what's in SB 420 as this notion of a collective, of a nonprofit group of patients coming together to solve this challenge in light of all these conflicting state and federal laws to find a solution, and have, as we've heard tonight, consistently referred to it as business and industry. That this entire new industry has developed that we've got to deal with, and so it's all or nothing. And that's not a path that we can get through, at least from my perspective. I don't know that I can vote for an ordinance that would allow folks from throughout the Central Valley who come from other communities where they need to exercise their own rights to vote and say, look, Davis City Council, I'm a Davis resident, you need to change your ordinance. Look, Woodland City Council, which just passed an outright ban earlier this month. Look, Yolo County Board of Supervisors. Look, City of Sacramento, get your act together. I'm not prepared to be the center of all dispensing of medical marijuana in the entire Sacramento Valley. As much as I believe in I voted for Prop 215, and as much as I believe in it for my own community, the implications of that, of an entirely untested industry in an entirely untested legal environment, aren't something I'm prepared to ask my little community to bear the risk and the liability of. And so if that's the position that the advocates and the attorneys are taking, then at least for me, when this comes back for a second reading, because I'm definitely supportive of having this move forward and the issues that will come up in our conversation, I'm signaling right now, I will not vote for it if the consequence is going to mean that all the advocates are going to be suing because it's not their perfect ordinance. And frankly, I think that would be horrible. It would be tragic, but we're not a city. We're not LA. We're not Oakland. We cannot be the first city to determine whether or not freedom of association and equal protection are compromised by our requirements with the ID card or some limitation on residency. That's just not we're not that place. It would be really sad because I know there are plenty of residents in our community and employees who desperately need access to this medication today. So I just want to I do have these specific issues, but I want to put that out there at the outset because it's a change for me, at least in the position I've been articulating for the last 6 months on the issue. Mr. Beers.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. When this was first raised to us, it really came to us because we were getting the applications, and I think this council had the courage to say, look, we're not going to bury our heads in the sand. Let's address it in a responsible way. And of course, tonight, and I couldn't agree more with the mayor, it sounds like we're reinventing the wheel. Our original instructions were to find a model of an ordinance that worked in other communities so that we could somewhat model that without any of this controversy so that we could get close. And so one of my first questions to staff is, how close are we is this ordinance to something that's been successful that hasn't been legally tested in other communities? I mean, because we didn't want to do a lot of independent staff work. We wanted to say, here's some examples of successful ordinances we believe, or at least we were led to believe, in other cities. What are they? Can we, adopt something that's very close, adapt it to our unique circumstances, and move on? And that's really all the effort I wanted to put in to this particular thing. I don't want to solve the world's problems for that. We have a specific issue. We have residents that could benefit from this. I'm more than happy to deal with it. I don't want to bury my head in the sand, but I'm not going to put us into a big legal fight that has no value to the broad group of citizens in West Sacramento. So where are we in relation to that simple, in my view, request?
From my understanding, we have incorporated some of the provisions of other jurisdictions using their models that seemed to address some of the concerns from and respond to the direction that we have received from Council and Planning Commission. So while it is its own individual unique ordinance, it does utilize some components of various jurisdictions throughout the state.
Okay. So you're kind of saying we tried to pick the best pieces out of different ordinances and blend them together?
That's correct. That's what we looked.
Okay. Now, the second question I have, and maybe it's not possible, I know that most contracts or most ordinances have a severability clause. So if one provision fails, that doesn't, affect the rest of the ordinance. Could we change that around and just put a flat poison pill into this ordinance? If we're going to do this and have the conversation that the mayor suggested, that we add to this ordinance, and if this is legally challenged, the whole thing goes away and we revert to a moratorium or some other appropriate legal action.
Yeah, what you're referring to, Mr. Beers, is a severability clause. There's nothing that requires us to have a severability clause. It can stand or fall.
No, but I mean, just build it right into any vote that we take on this ordinance that says
it can be considered.
If this is challenged, then the whole thing goes away. Okay. All right. Well, I would be prepared to have a discussion on some of the specifics as long as we put, what I'm calling a poison pill or some sort of a, takeaway, so that if anybody wants to solve the world's problems, fine. Our ordinance goes away and you guys can take credit for it.
Can I ask on that point, because I obviously share that point of view. If we were challenged, if litigation was filed against the ordinance, and we responded by repealing it immediately, would we have the authority, given the specific ways in which the moratoriums are authorized under state law, would we have the ability, since we would have interrupted the moratorium, to return to it, or would we face the Los Angeles problem?
No, there is a way to get back into a moratorium. I'm not prepared to give you the exact process because I haven't looked at it in a while, but I understand your question, and there is a way to get back in a moratorium. We just need to be careful how we do it.
Sure. Okay, Mayor Pro Tem Villegas and Mr. Johannesson.
So just to follow that a little bit, so if we were to institute something like that, would it be if any part of the ordinance is challenged, or it would have to actually go through the court process and then we'd have to endure all the costs?
I actually have 2 or 3 other suggestions for the council at the appropriate time.
Okay, good enough. Then I'll leave it at that. I figured if I stayed quiet long enough, all the difficult issues would be work themselves out. But and I was right. They have. I think the council has raised all the appropriate issues at the moment. It seems to me as if we're just trying to make the best of the situation. I think we've struck a balance in what we've proposed this evening. I totally agree. We need the severability clause because I agree with the mayor. I don't think we need to try to figure out how to resolve the world's issues this evening. And I thought we laid out what makes perfectly good sense. I guess I'm just struck, and then the last thing I'll say, because I agree with what's already been said, I guess I'm just struck a little bit by the conversation this evening. I mean, I heard repeatedly this evening the terms needed relief and medicine and medication and medicine. And I guess I connect that with the need for medication as prescribed by a physician or somebody who has authority to do so. And maybe I'm overstating its purpose, but for me, I want to make sure that as we move forward, we're not creating something that goes beyond that. I know the conversation this evening has been centered around that because, frankly, that makes a good policy discussion because no one wants to talk about people buying pot, smoking pot to have a good time with no real medical cause because that's not popular and that's not going to create good public policy. So that conversation is never really going to happen up here, I don't think, in an honest way. And I guess what I need to make sure of is as we move forward that we're not having that, not letting that occur. And I think what we've put together this evening does the best job to try to prevent that from happening. And so I think in terms of the identification card, there needs to be something in there that actually addresses the medical, the real, the true, the honest medical purpose for marijuana and not simply, and I'll be honest, I mean, I know, and everybody sitting in here this evening probably knows, there are people who can get the cards around the corner tomorrow with no real medical purpose, at least as I see a medical purpose. And there are physicians who will issue the cards in a heartbeat, and everybody knows who those physicians are, and the people who just want to smoke pot are going to go get that card, they're going to get it tomorrow, and they're going to have access to it. So, I mean, we need to be honest about the conversation. I think Bill raised some good points about the legitimacy of where this stuff comes from. But I think it's all been addressed this evening, and I think what we've got is a relatively good plan. The severability clause makes perfectly good sense. I look forward to that conversation when the time is right.
Mr. Johannesson.
Bob, the moratorium ends in July 2011, their maximum extension. Can that be extended beyond that date?
No.
Okay, so part of the problem is litigation's slow. One of the issues, and I understand the concept of or Plan B would be to wait to the, just extend the moratorium fully out and wait till we have some resolution in some other cases, but it seems to me that this hasn't been fully tested. And I don't think there's really, have you found an ordinance that has been fully tested that we can use as a model? Because I think the problem is, if this lawsuit's filed next summer, it's going to be in the throes of a lawsuit by the time our moratorium expires, and we have no options at that point.
Well, I actually think you may have some other options, but I'm resistant to express them here tonight.
Okay. All right. I mean, from my perspective, it's really, I mean, the residency thing, the three issues that were mentioned here, I agree with the rest of my council that we don't want to be in a position where we're getting sued, and I don't think you could stop getting sued. But certainly the obvious issues that were raised tonight, the residency, I think is probably the primary one. I'm not so sure that for me that's it's got to be West Sac, because I think there's enough going on in Sacramento in the area that it's not like people are going to come to West Sac to do this over Sacramento. But I think the ranking system is going to be important. I'm not convinced that the 5 criteria here, although they are objective and it makes it a bit easier to do, I think we really have to be careful about who we choose as the eventual operator. And the identification issue, I understand the point that it could be expensive, but we also have to look at the ability of the police to do their job here. And so I would be less inclined to budge on that. But the residency, I think I'm flexible on. Ranking system, I think we really should look at something, past conduct and things like that we can get into, how these people have operated before. Because I think a lot of that's going to address what other council have addressed is the legitimacy of these things. And to the extent you've got a track history and you show you're legitimate, I think that's a plus. And for someone who's just coming in, hasn't done it before, well, you really don't know what's going on there. And, it's like going with someone who has a reputation, an organization that has a reputation, they've got these things, and other places that are working well. It kind of adds a little more credence when they're looking at opening these things up. So I'm, as far as having an ordinance that has been fully tested, and as Councilmember Beers has mentioned, I'm not sure if these have been. Maybe someone just hasn't gotten around to suing. So it's not like we have really any safe ordinance at this point to use as a model, I don't think, unless you found one that's been fully vetted, and that's the problem.
If they exist, we don't know them.
Yeah, so that's the problem.
More likely, there's a lot that have been adopted but not challenged.
Right, and I would say that probably the attack would be to, if LA is going to do one like LA, and then track changes LA make, and we track those changes. When LA gets sued, we join in that with them. So it's exactly the same issues. But, I don't know a way around that without any, anything that's in this problem. It's a legislative problem.
Yeah, I mean, we're trapped in this is why we all hate big city politics, and where you have interest groups and attorneys who come to make policy, and it prevents us from making the sort of pragmatic solutions that have transformed our city from other side of the tracks to one of the region's models. We could never have done that if we had all these former attorneys, current attorneys, national organizations, and everyone else here giving us their bottom lines constantly. I mean, that's the frustrating part, because we all see the patient issues that are at risk because somebody wants to make an example out of us, when all we have wanted to do is figure out what is a way, a pragmatic, sort of simple, small-town West Sac way to take care of our basic concerns and get this at least started. To me, and I said this at the last hearing, we ought to be, in 2 years from now, we ought to be coming back to this ordinance saying, boy, we were really overreacting. Just like today, we dispense much more dangerous drugs than this at Rite Aid, right next to the ice cream counter, right? I mean, it's not an issue. But we need the chance to be able to adopt a framework that allows us and neighbors and community members to be able to get comfortable and say it's just like a pharmacy. Or it's just like a support group at the church, whatever the structure is. It's something I'm comfortable with in my community, and then that allows us to come back to the ordinance and say, okay, we can tune this one down a little, fix this over here. That's how a small town solves its problems, not with constant threats every four speaker cards that we're going to sue you. So that's the frustration that we're all trying to deal with, and to end up with a moratorium or a Woodland Davis style total ban, I think is a travesty. But I see it going that way if we can't get some folks to be more cooperative around letting us adopt something that's reasonable for us, that isn't the national, that doesn't get on the front page of Americans for Medical Marijuana Access as the vanguard of everything, but that at least solves some problems and gets some basic access for our patients. Mr. Beers.
Yeah, well, in order to at least try and move the workshop's discussion forward, I want to clarify that I don't want a severability clause to go back to a moratorium. I would just say ban it. I mean, that it's an either or would be how I would approach that. And for me, that's the only way that I would consider something, just so that we could avoid any potential litigation. If people want to throw the baby out with the bathwater for what we're trying to do, then more power to them. As far as some of this goes, I really do think some sort of competitive process makes a lot more sense to me, and I think it makes more sense to me. Not that the criteria that was described by staff aren't good, that should be part of anything we do, but I think that we should look for people that want to come in that have a broader health mission. I see that, in my view, the dispensary is a small portion of a larger health-oriented operation. I don't know what the right words are, but so that would be where I'd want to head, at least from my perspective. And on the ID card, I'm just missing the point of why that's a problem. I'll just leave it at that. I don't see it. I'm probably not part of the people that use it, but it sounds simple to me, and I could do it. On the residency requirement, I guess my leaning is more towards something that's specifically oriented to West Sacramento, but I'm not 100% solid that it has to be only that. I don't know whether maybe the majority of the cooperative has to be from West Sacramento, or there's some Yolo County connection, because it sounded to me like legally there has to be some connection between the city or county or something. So I'm not totally sure, but I could move on an absolute residency for West Sac if there was some basis for it. And the reason I say that is because at the end of the day, I don't want to put an ordinance together that nobody could operate and actually make it work. I mean, it looks pretty on paper, but it didn't solve the problem. So I'm a little worried about something that's too narrow. If we're going to take this effort, if it's too narrow and it won't work financially, then that doesn't make any sense to me, and we should stop the process now. So I would be willing to see if there was some way of working on that specific issue in order to do that. And I know there's some specific pieces in here, like, I read someplace where a child couldn't be in the facility. Well, if it was a broader health-oriented business, then children could be part of it. I think it's more about unaccompanied children or something like that, rather than try to, manage every specific piece of this. I mean, it needs to be dealt with as a family or patient care orientation, as opposed to strict. If you're 17 and a half and you're in the facility, that kind of stuff. We don't want to just get anal about all of those rules. And so again, some of the stuff on paraphernalia or ability to use the product, you know, I mean, total bans, if it's more of a health-oriented type facility, that might make sense to have some pieces to that. So again, if we orient this a little bit more towards a patient health model type of an action that has appropriate safeguards for the things that we don't want to happen, which we've seen in other communities, then that would give me a little bit more comfort. And then all of that packaged with some sort of a poison pill that just says, you know, if people want to fight over this, then fight somewhere else.
I think those are great comments. And they're true for me too. The ID card for me is one of those bottom line issues. So if it's not possible to do without the whole industry going insane, then we ought to just stop wasting each other's time. So to me, that is an issue. The residency issue, I mean, I can envision other ways to do it, so I think it's worth thinking about it. But the basic concept needs to be in place. And so, you know, somebody suggested in one of the written communications that we had that, we already limited the number of dispensaries. We could instead limit the number of total patients, and that would solve the whole central, you know, becoming the center for the whole Central Valley. You could do that, set some limit on the total number of people served if we're not going to violate the freedom of association issues that have been raised by our attorney friends. And require that there be priority to West Sacramento residents and then second priority to West Sacramento employees, which would, and while still regulating the overall number in a way that gets at the issue that you're raising, which is, okay, you know, in year one, if 65 West Sacramento residents sign up, it may not be enough for two collectives. That may not be enough to make that work. So that you could actually, deliver the medication to those patients. So I mean, that makes sense to me as a potential way to get to that issue, which is we need to have an operable model, but still, the point of this is to make sure that we're serving our own residents. So I think that might be one way to deal with the residency. It doesn't deal with all the constitutional issues and the national precedent issues that other folks want to deal with, but in terms of the making something that's possible for a nonprofit collective to actually function, I think it might. I said earlier, I'm not sure 2 is the right magic number, and whether it's a total number of patients or if it's 3, whatever. I mean, the flip side of the restriction, I like the restriction because it deals with this. We don't want to be the center of the entire planet issue, and we don't want a marijuana dispensary on every corner. At the same time, for the patients, if we only have one, for example, then the monopoly power on pricing that collective has for patients is severe, right? I mean, and 2 makes it better, but it may not, that may not be enough. That's why I just want to be sure that we get the right balance between not having a proliferation of collectives and dispensaries everywhere, but also not creating so much market power for 1 or 2 lucky winners of the lottery that they have the ability to essentially extort large sums of money out of folks who are, almost by definition already seriously economically disadvantaged because of their medical condition. And so I don't want to propose a different magic number. I would just like you to, as you're looking at this, as I feel that we attend to that issue about scale and number and make sure that we're price competitive. As I mentioned earlier, the Sebastopol testimony around of some ability to grant variances around the locational criteria. Because the challenge with you gave us a map that showed the zoning, and I don't know if you checked that also with the residents, the 1,000-foot limitations, the 250-foot limitations, and all of that. But if you sort of grabbed a person on the street and said, "Would you rather have a marijuana dispensary next to IKEA or McDonald's or In-N-Out Burger," which this would allow, or in the completely industrial area of the city on the other side of the freeway? I suspect, the folks who would be the most concerned about the potential, abuse of or corollary impacts from these facilities would rather have it not be where there's more children in and out in McDonald's than there are at a school at parts of the day. So that doesn't really, to me, having the Harbor Center and the IKEA Center being the 2 principal locations in the city where we'd be directing dispensaries doesn't quite make sense. The rules all make sense till you add them up and you look and see what the consequence is. They're going to be at McDonald's. So we ought to either look at a variance procedure and/or rethink the rules that we've put in place. Because to me, if we're worried about neighborhood impacts, those aren't the locations. It's more industrial locations that would make sense. Other than plus, if we're talking about nonprofit collectives, the rents at the IKEA Center are going to be probably cost prohibitive for a small collection of patients who are dealing with terminal or other illnesses and trying to pay for their medication. So I'm not sure. We ought to look at that zoning matrix. I get how we got there. The rules all by themselves. You look, okay, no, not close to a school, whatever. That all adds up. But when you put it all on a map, you're like, okay, it doesn't work when it's all put together at the end. So, and then as I said, I agree on the whole random issue. I think some other procedure or ranking makes sense. So, Mr. Kristoff.
Yeah, I think my colleagues make some good points. I mean, if there are any issues or anything like that really sort of surface that become deal breakers and somebody's gonna sue, either you go the moratorium process or you just say the heck with it and no, we're not gonna have an ordinance. Now, for me, one of the important parts of all of that ordinance, the most important is residency for me. I mean, I think that is absolutely critical. And I don't know if that has been tested anyplace else. I mean, I don't think it would be unique to us, but I mean, at the same time, if that has been tested someplace else, well then, that's one, to me, that's the most important issue. The ID issue is also important. I'd like to see that. I mean, I really don't understand the objection to that. And then, of course, the competitive process, if it can be tweaked, I don't have a lot of problem with that. If it can be tweaked and we get the best dispensary people in here, that's fine. The number of dispensaries, I think 2 is a good number. It may be 3, but I think 2 is a good number. And I do think we could start with 1 and see what it does as far as generating the amount of revenues that are necessary to serve the people that have health issues. To me, that's really the most important part of all of this, and that is to ensure that it is those people with chronic health issues that are ones that are getting served and not slipping away and getting out from under our control and getting into the element that you see around town. So anyway, and then of course for me, the other important part of that will be the strong enforcement and the police powers. For me to go ahead and support that, I'm going to need to have very strong police powers. So, thank you.
So, this is a workshop only. We're not taking any final action. But do you have, Mr. City Attorney, you had the solution to everything that you've been holding in your pocket that you're going to tell us at the end? No, you've changed your mind. Okay. All right. So, do you have sufficient direction to proceed with?
Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry. I will make sure I answer your question. I have some other ideas about the downside responses the council might have, but I want to share those in a different forum with you.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So you have sufficient direction to proceed to the next stage, which is a public hearing on the ordinance is tentatively scheduled for January 13th, 2010. Right. Yes, and then the moratorium extension will be scheduled
for January 13th.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, I said January 10th. It's January 13th for both then. All right. Okay, so thank you. Thanks to everyone, including the attorneys that I've been bashing for the last half an hour. Thanks to everyone for joining us this evening and participating in the workshop and helping us to craft an effective ordinance. All right, item 19 is consideration of a resolution. Mr. Beers has to depart. Thank you very much. Item 19 is consideration of resolution 09-87 of the City of West Sacramento, declaring its intention to establish Community Facilities District Number 27, Bridge District, and to levy a special tax and to incur a bond and indebtedness to pay for certain public facilities, and declaring its official intent to reimburse certain expenditures from the proceeds of the debt in consideration of a contract amendment with Economic and Planning Systems Incorporated for completion of CFD 27 formation. Ms. Zussman? And we have from Shannon, we have a revised recommendation in writing at our desk.
That's correct. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. This item is the resolution of intent to form Community Facilities District Number 27 in the Bridge District. We were before council on March the 11th in a workshop format that presented the CFD structure. Since that time, we've been working with the property owners, city staff on moving the specific plans forward as well as the development agreements. And today we have a modified CFD structure for your consideration. The purpose of the financing program is really to identify sources of funding for $248 million worth of infrastructure within the Bridge District. We want to identify those sources of funding in a way that's compatible with our guiding objectives. Those are in your staff report, but really the idea is to provide a structure that incents higher density so that the type of development that's identified in the specific plan could actually be developed. The key financing sources are the revenue generated from CFD 27, tax increment generated from the Bridge District, and then grant funding that would come in the future, as well as grants that we have already received. There's really three key elements of CFD 27. The first is an annual special tax on undeveloped property. This tax would be levied at a maximum rate of 40 cents per net land square foot, and it would really provide the authorization to issue bonds during the summer of 2010 as part of the Prop 1C infrastructure program. The second element of CFD 27 is a tax on developed property, and that would be levied when a building is constructed, and it's set at a rate of 50 cents per building square foot for both residential and commercial. There's also a one-time special tax program, which is really similar to development impact fees. It would be collected at this final inspection time. And there's two elements. One would be for Bridge District infrastructure, and the other would be for regional infrastructure outside of the Bridge District. Both of those elements would be collected on a land square foot basis in order to incent higher densities. And for the Bridge District one-time special tax, if the development project did not reach the target FARs identified, there would be an additional one-time special tax to make up for the lost revenue of a lower density project. Both of the one-time special taxes are tiered so that the earlier that you develop, the lower the rate is, and the more that you develop, at a later date, the higher the rate. The results of the financing structure are shown in this table with the sources and uses of funds. You can see there's about $150 million worth of backbone infrastructure, about $98 million worth of supplemental for a $248 million program. About 35% of the revenue would come from CFD 27, as well as the current CFD 23 that's already in place. The Bridge District tax increment would yield about $70 million in revenue. Those two categories have been reduced in terms of the revenue generated from what you saw in March. The reason is outlined in your staff report that the rates for CFD 27 were lowered in order to enhance financial feasibility, and the values associated with development in the Bridge District were lowered, which generated a little bit less tax increment. The results of those changes are that we are relying on more grant funding in the future than we originally planned to rely on, but staff felt comfortable with that assumption given that a lot of that grant funding would go to the ultimate promenade improvements along the riverfront, and in the meantime, we do have a plan that would provide a recreational amenity the length of the riverfront that could last for many years. There was 2 additional provisions in the current structure that were not in the March presentation. One is a state reimbursement land special tax, and the other is a public agency acquisition one-time special tax. The reimbursement tax would be in effect in the event that the housing obligations that are required as part of the Proposition 1C grant were not completely fulfilled. In that event, the city could levy a tax on undeveloped property to assist in the repayment obligation to the state. And the public agency acquisition tax would be levied on tax-exempt property after a 2 million square feet of tax-exempt property was constructed in the Bridge District. And the sort of formula for levying that tax would be the lost tax increment from the time that the tax-exempt building was constructed between that point in time and the end of the redevelopment plan to identify the lost tax increment from that particular project. These 2 items we did come to agreement with the owners at our meeting this afternoon to provide those provisions in the tax formula. The memo you have before you identifies those solutions. And really sort of the next steps would be to consider the resolution before you this evening. If approved, we would return on February 3rd with the resolution of formation. We would do the election for the CFD in early May, and then we would plan to sell bonds in the summer of 2010. We have other members of the Bridge District team here to answer any questions. We have some property owners as well as EPS here, and I'm available for questions.
So we have no request to speak on this, so we'll return it directly to the council. Mr. Christoph.
The bond indebtedness that is secured by the property, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then could you explain to me on page 3 of 5, no surplus revenue projected to be generated from the project, number 7?
Sure. In the financing structure that we brought to you in March,
right,
we had identified annual CFD tax rates of $1 per building square foot for residential and 50 cents for commercial. And we'd also identified values for the new construction that would come in the Bridge District at a level that's higher than we're currently assuming. So the results of that are that you're generating less revenue from the CFD, and you're also generating less revenue from tax increment. When we ran that model forward, the projection of surplus tax increment that we identified in March no longer existed. Now, it's still possible that we could have surplus revenue moving forward, particularly if absorption moves more quickly than we're currently projecting. But when we did make those adjustments to the cash flow, the surplus revenue was no longer there.
Okay, thank you.
Shanna, on the new version of 3.7, the annual special tax levy, I'm trying to do this calculation in my head. That's, I don't know, 32 steps. How is it different from what was, from what we had originally?
Sure. The original language was much more general, and it essentially said that you could levy up to $1.10 per net land square foot throughout the district to make the repayment. And the general language was put in as a placeholder while we worked through some of the details. The more lengthy process that's in your memo gets at allows you to vary the tax by zone. And the zones are structured according to who has an obligation under Prop 1C. So to the extent that you perform well relative to your own obligation, you're allowed to reduce your repayment tax proportionate to that, to your performance.
Okay, in step 1B, the subtracting out the regional infrastructure.
Correct.
So let me see if I understand. So it's the components of the regional infrastructure that are funded through the grant, but they're scored as beyond the Bridge District regional stuff in our plans. I mean, the issue is whether or not those are not necessarily infrastructure items that we would have undertaken in the absence of the Prop 1 of the grant, right? I mean, we have a certain amount of resources for regional improvements everywhere in the city at any one time. We've directed them to the Bridge District because of that grant, and because the property owners had made covenants that they would deliver the housing obligation under that grant. They don't deliver they don't deliver the obligation, and so my understanding is that then, but their repayment obligation doesn't include any of the regional infrastructure. Is that how it would work?
Well, I think the particular facility we're talking about here is B Tower Bridge Gateway East, and so there's a certain portion of that improvement that benefits the entire city. And so to the extent that the grant funds all or a portion of those improvements, and we did have to repay, we would net out the non-Bridge District share of that particular improvement.
All right, but do you understand what I'm saying? That essentially, I mean, we took the risk, but we would be entirely responsible for those. We would not necessarily be invested, even though that provides some benefit to the remainder of to the city. That's why it's scored as regional improvement. Tower Bridge Gateway East and 3rd and 5th Street may not have been projects that we would have used our limited resources to fund had it not been for the commitment that these units would be produced, therefore allowing us to have that paid for through the state. But this formula doesn't recognize that.
Right.
It essentially says, too bad for us. I mean, we've spent money on stuff that would be useful on a regional scale, but only if the Bridge District stuff was in place. I mean, 3rd and 5th Street, those improvements aren't really of great citywide benefit without the actual amenities and housing and development occurring in the Bridge District. They're only regional improvements because of the Bridge District in the first place. So I want to flag it. I'm not going to vote no on this because of this, but I want to flag this for so it goes on Mr. Christoph's list when he reiterates next year when there's another item before us of things that we have done that Art Savage never would have done if he were our negotiator, because we're trying to make this project work. But it is a give for the city to say that we have diverted resources to this, even though you've not made your obligation. Now, everybody intends to meet their obligations just as a pure business deal. This is not how I would have structured it if we were just looking out for the interests of city government alone and not trying to assist with the overall project. But that's the only change so it's just but that was in the original version too, right? It was in what we already had.
Correct.
This is just dealing with the distribution.
Correct.
Instead of the $1.10 per foot piece. Okay. All right. Are there questions or comments?
Well,
Mr. Christoph?
No, never mind. I beat that dog to death, so I'll let it go.
The dog will be back again, don't worry.
Yeah, I know that dog always comes. Boy, trust me, that dog comes back. Because I mean, we did some things earlier for. That's all right. Never mind. Sorry. Okay.
Mr. Ross?
Done whipping that dog.
No, the only point I was going to suggest, but it's not critical, is that the magnitude of those regional improvements are not large, and so that was part of the consideration. Had they been sizable, we might have come down on a different place.
Me too. Okay. All right. If there's no further discussion, is there a motion on the item with the revised recommendation from staff? Okay. Mr. Johanneson's moved the revised staff recommendations. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries. Thank you. That brings us to council calendar. Mrs. Richardson?
Isn't it amazing how it spends?
Mr. Mayor, this is our last meeting of the month, and City Hall will be closed from December 24th through until January 4th. In regards to the meeting on January 6th, you're going to have just the one item concerning the Bridge District. And the council does have the option of meeting a little bit earlier than 7 o'clock if that's your desire. But we've checked with the property owners, and they are fine with meeting early if that's earlier, if that was the council's desire.
Well, that would be really good. I'd like to meet at 4.
This would be non-retiree time.
Oh. Darn.
And while you're
6
thinking,
gotta work. Well, no, you gotta eat, so. I don't know what to tell you guys.
Yeah, I think we were thinking of 6 o'clock if you wanted
Yeah.
to do it earlier.
If you really want to, it's fine with me. I mean, I'm fine, frankly, I'm used to 7, it's natural to me, but I'm fine with 6 o'clock.
You're fine with 4, too.
At 4 o'clock, not so much.
Oh.
Okay, so, see, Mr. Johansson, are you okay with 6?
I'm, yeah, good, either way.
Okay,
so that was 6?
if that's what you want.
And then we learned recently that on January 9th, from 9 to noon, that's on a Saturday, the school district will be having a public meeting to get input on the selection process for the new superintendent. So the place is still to be determined.
Is that it?
And no, it's not.
I can't see what's going, I can't see you, so I don't know what's going on over there.
On January 13th, Los Rios Community College District is going to be having the dedication of the center across the street. That's at 10 a.m. in the morning.
On what day?
January 13th?
Oh, January 13th, okay. We have a council meeting that night. Does that meeting get canceled, right?
I'm finished now.
Oh, that's it, okay. Any
I'm
questions on the
sorry.
calendar?
Yeah, so that means the 13th council meeting gets canceled then, right?
Because of a 10 a.m. dedication?
Oh,
Wow.
damn.
There's plenty of time for a nap in
No,
between.
we're meeting on the,
Hey, I'm willing to go at 4 o'clock, you know? Get it done, do things. Dang.
All right, city manager report,
Nothing this evening, Mr. Mayor.
city attorney report,
Nothing more.
staff direction from members of the council, Mr. Johansson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. There was a dedication of the Washington Monument this last week. Councilmember Villegas attended that. One of the issues there was, the aspect of the entrance into the city and having a good first impression. I've been noticing that off of Jefferson, it's starting to look a little bit off. Is there something we can do to maybe focus maintenance on that area? There's, trash and things of that nature. It's just a comment. I don't know. I don't want to do a general allocation or request a general allocation of resources, but it is important when people drive into the city, we've got a little bit nicer look, and we're doing that off the I Street Bridge, and we probably should be looking at, it's more of a landscaping issue, I think, off of Jefferson.
Just to get a clarification, are we talking about the off-ramp
Right.
at Jefferson?
Right.
Okay.
The off-ramp going on to Jefferson off of 50.
Right, coming from 50, like
Right, where
the
Pacific
westbound.
Bell, yeah.
Westbound,
right,
okay.
right.
Yes. We can take a look at that. We do actually have more intense maintenance there, but not all of that is ours. Some of it's Caltrans.
Yeah, I mean, that seems where a lot of the problem is underneath the bridge. It's just bare dirt. It's, yeah.
All right, and we have no future agenda item requests, so is there a motion to adjourn? So moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries unanimously. Meeting is adjourned.